Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through two of England's most remarkable kings, Edward I, Longshanks, and his legendary grandson Edward III, spanning over a century of medieval triumph, conquest, and transformation from 1272 to 1377. We'll softly explore the rise of the Plantagenet dynasty from Edward I's troubled youth during England's civil wars, through his emergence as the hammer of the Scots, and gently arrive at Edward II's golden reign that established England as medieval Europe's greatest military power. While the medieval world was shifting from feudal kingdoms toward emerging nation-states, before you drift away into peaceful sleep, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which medieval king you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 13th and 14th centuries lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Edward, later known as King Edward I, Longshanks, entered this world during the darkness of a summer night. Born sometime between the evening hours of June 17th and the early dawn of June 18th, 1239, his first breath was drawn within the stone walls of Westminster Palace, which at that time stood on the western edges of London, far from the bustling heart of the growing city. The infant prince was born into a realm of contradiction and uncertainty. His father, Henry III, had worn England's crown since childhood, ascending the throne at merely 9 years old following the death of the controversial King John in 1216. By the time of Edward's birth, Henry had ruled for over 2 decades, yet he was only beginning to truly exercise the full authority of kingship as he approached his 30s. Henry III was a man of deep religious devotion, particularly devoted to the veneration of Saint Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king who had ruled England before the Norman conquest. It was in honor of this sainted monarch that Henry chose to name his firstborn son Edward, hoping perhaps that the child would embody the virtues of his holy namesake, the Queen Mother. Eleanor of Provence brought French nobility and grace to the English court. She had arrived in England 3 years before Edward's birth as a young bride, part of a marriage alliance that had proven both politically advantageous and personally fulfilling. Unlike many royal unions of the era, which were arranged purely for diplomatic gain, the marriage between Henry and Eleanor blossomed into genuine affection and companionship. In the years following Edward's arrival, the royal couple would welcome 4 additional children into their growing family. A son named Edmund would join them, followed by 3 daughters, Margaret, Beatrice, and Catherine. Tragically, young Catherine would not survive to see her 4th birthday, a reminder of the harsh realities of medieval childhood, mortality that even royal blood could not always overcome. The England into which Prince Edward was born bore little resemblance to the unified kingdom it would become under his future rule. The realm was still reeling from the turbulent legacy of his grandfather, King John, whose reign from 1199 to 1216 had been marked by military disasters and political upheaval. John's catastrophic losses in France during the early 1200s had cost England much of its vast continental empire, including the crucial Duchy of Normandy, which had been the heart of English power across the Channel since William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066. The domestic situation had proven equally challenging during John's final years. The First Barons' War had erupted in the mid-1210s as England's noble families rose in rebellion against their king's arbitrary rule and excessive taxation. Though John had attempted to appease his critics by agreeing to the Magna Carta in 1215, this great charter of liberties had failed to bring lasting peace to the realm when 9-year-old Henry inherited his father's troubled crown. The kingdom remained deeply divided. The new king's minority government struggled to maintain authority, while powerful court factions vied for influence over the young monarch. These early experiences of political instability would profoundly shape Henry's character, making him cautious and somewhat ineffective as a ruler, traits that would later drive his eldest son toward a very different approach to kingship. Throughout Edward's childhood, the realm continued to experience the aftershocks of these earlier conflicts. Wales remained largely independent under its native princes, who had successfully resisted English encroachment during the chaos of John's reign. Scotland, too, had grown more assertive in asserting its independence from English overlordship. Meanwhile, the loss of Normandy and other French territories meant that England's remaining continental possessions in Gascony were increasingly vulnerable to French pressure, as was customary for royal children of the medieval period. Young Edward was raised primarily apart from his parents in his own separate household. This arrangement was considered essential for proper noble education and helped protect the heir from the political intrigues that constantly swirled around the adult court. Surviving letters from Henry III reveal a father's genuine concern for his son's welfare, though these concerns sometimes took forms that might seem unusual by modern standards. In one notable instance, from 1242, when Edward was approximately 3 years old, the king expressed worry that his son was not receiving sufficiently good wine to drink. The care and education of the young prince were entrusted to a succession of noble guardians. Initially, Hugh Gifford oversaw Edward's upbringing, but in 1246, when the prince reached his 7th year, responsibility transferred to Bartholomew Petch, a close friend and trusted advisor of the king. Around this same time, serious concerns arose regarding Edward's health, with mysterious ailments that caused considerable anxiety at court. These health issues would persist into the early 1250s, before finally resolving themselves. The details of Edward's formal education remain somewhat sparse in the historical record, but we can infer much from the practices of the time and his later abilities. This was an era when the education of future kings emphasized practical skills over scholarly pursuits, while Edward would learn to read and write in both English and French, and would acquire some familiarity with Latin. His training focused primarily on the martial arts that would serve him as a medieval monarch. Horsemanship was considered the foundation of noble education, as a king needed to command from horseback and lead cavalry charges in battle. Edward learned to handle the powerful war horses bred specifically for combat and to fight effectively while mounted. He mastered the use of sword, lance, and shield, developing the physical strength and coordination that would later make him a formidable warrior. Hunting served as both recreation and military training, teaching skills in tracking, archery, and the management of horses and hounds. These expeditions also provided opportunities to learn the geography of the realm, and to develop the endurance necessary for long campaigns. Edward showed particular aptitude for these physical pursuits, growing tall and strong as he matured by the mid-1250s. As Edward approached his 16th birthday, his father began granting him greater responsibilities and independence. The prince was given authority over several of the crown's most important possessions outside England proper. Ireland, with its complex mix of English settlements and native kingdoms, came under Edward's oversight, providing him with substantial revenues and his first taste of governing a challenging territory, Gascony, England's remaining stronghold. In southwestern France, also fell under Edward's authority. This region required delicate handling, as it remained technically a fief of the French crown, while serving English interests. The income from Gascony's wine trade and other enterprises made it a valuable possession. But managing its affairs required diplomatic skill and an understanding of continental politics. Most significantly, Edward received extensive powers over Wales, where English authority had been steadily eroding for decades. The Welsh princes had taken advantage of England's domestic turmoil to reassert their independence, and substantial portions of Wales had slipped from English control. This responsibility would prove formative for Edward, giving him first-hand experience with the challenges of ruling a proud and resistant people who viewed English authority as foreign occupation. The formal recognition of Edward's new status came in 1256, when his official seal began appearing on documents related to Irish affairs, marking his emergence as a significant political figure in his own right. This development reflected not only his growing maturity, but also his father's recognition that the heir needed practical experience in governance before assuming the throne. In 1254, at the remarkably young age of 15, Edward entered into marriage with Eleanor of Castile, who was herself barely 14. This union represented far more than a romantic attachment between two teenagers. It was a carefully calculated political alliance designed to strengthen England's position in its remaining French territories. Gascony bordered the Kingdom of Castile in northern Spain, and the marriage was intended to create a buffer of friendly relations that might help protect English interests from French expansion. Despite its entirely political origins, the marriage between Edward and Eleanor would prove to be one of the great love stories of medieval royalty. The young couple developed a deep and lasting affection for one another that would endure throughout their lives together. Eleanor would accompany Edward on his travels and campaigns, even joining him on his later crusade to the Holy Land, demonstrating a devotion that went far beyond the typical arrangements of royal marriages. Their union would be blessed with numerous children over the course of more than 3 decades together. Historical records suggest they had as many as 14 children, though the exact number remains uncertain due to the high rates of infant mortality that characterized the medieval period. These births typically occurred over a span of 20 years, between 1264 and 1284, reflecting the close bond between the royal couple. Tragically, only a handful of their children would survive to adulthood. Their son, the future Edward II, would be their only male heir to reach maturity, while 5 daughters, Eleanor, Joan, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, would also survive childhood. However, Eleanor herself would die before reaching her 30th year, adding to the couple's sorrows. The loss of at least 8 children to infancy and childhood diseases created a burden of grief that was heavy even by the harsh standards of medieval mortality. As the 1250s progressed, Edward found himself increasingly drawn into the political turmoil that had characterized his father's entire reign. The young prince's position became particularly complicated as tensions mounted between Henry III and his powerful barons, who grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as the king's financial mismanagement and his favoritism toward foreign relatives and advisors. The crisis came to a head in 1258 when a group of rebellious nobles, led by the formidable Simon de Montfort, forced King Henry to accept a series of radical reforms known as the Provisions of Oxford. These measures effectively stripped the king of much of his authority, placing the government of England in the hands of a council of 15 barons, selected from among the realm's most powerful magnates. Edward's role in these dramatic events proved both complex and controversial. Rather than supporting his father unconditionally, the young prince found himself sympathetic to many of the barons' grievances. He had witnessed firsthand the problems created by his father's weak leadership and seemingly endless financial difficulty when an even more extreme set of reforms, known as the Provisions of Westminster, was imposed on the king in 1259. Edward actually lent his support to the rebellious lords. This support for his father's enemies revealed much about Edward's character and political instincts. Unlike his father, who was often paralyzed by indecision and overly influenced by court favorites, Edward showed an early ability to assess political situations pragmatically and align himself with the strongest position. His willingness to oppose his own father when he believed the crown was in the wrong demonstrated both political courage and a commitment to what he saw as the greater good of the realm. The baronial government that emerged from these reforms gave Edward greater authority and influence than he had previously enjoyed under his father's direct rule. The young prince found himself with enhanced responsibilities and the opportunity to gain valuable experience in the practical business of governing. This period served as crucial preparation for his future role as king, teaching him lessons about the importance of maintaining the support of the nobility and the dangers of alienating powerful subjects. However, King Henry III had no intention of accepting this diminishment of royal authority permanently. By the late 1250s, he had begun working to restore his position, seeking support from his brother-in-law, King Louis IX of France. In exchange for French backing, Henry formally relinquished England's remaining claims to Normandy and other lost territories in northern France, accepting what had already become a political reality. With French financial and military support secured, Henry returned to England in 1260 and began the process of reasserting royal control. The political pendulum swung back toward the crown as many nobles who had initially supported the reforms began to have second thoughts about the radical changes they had imposed. By late 1261, Simon de Montfort had been forced into exile in France, and Edward had reconciled with his father after a period of tense negotiations. This reconciliation marked Edward's first major political reversal, but it also demonstrated his pragmatic approach to politics. As the balance of power shifted back toward the crown, Edward recognized that his interests lay in supporting his father, rather than continuing to back the increasingly isolated baronial opposition. This flexibility and willingness to change course when circumstances required it would become a hallmark of Edward's political style throughout his career. The peace proved temporary, however, as Simon de Montfort refused to accept defeat. In the spring of 1263, he returned from his French exile and began organizing a new opposition movement centered at Oxford. The political situation deteriorated rapidly as armed confrontations broke out between royal forces and the rebellious barons. By winter, de Montfort's alliance had managed to seize control of London, giving them a crucial strategic advantage. The dispute was submitted to King Louis IX of France for arbitration, but his decision proved unsatisfactory to the baronial party. Louis sided firmly with his fellow monarch, proposing the complete annulment of the earlier provisions and the full restoration of Henry III's authority. Faced with this setback, de Montfort and his allies chose to renew their armed resistance, initiating what historians would later term the Second Barons' War. This time, Edward stood firmly with his father from the beginning. The experiences of the previous few years had taught him valuable lessons about the dangers of divided authority and the importance of maintaining royal prerogative. When open warfare erupted in 1264, Edward played a crucial role in the royal war effort, demonstrating the military skills he had been developing throughout his youth. The prince's first major military success came in April 1264, when he led the successful capture of Northampton, where one of Simon de Montfort's sons had been gathering a substantial baronial army. This victory demonstrated Edward's growing competence as a military commander and provided an early indication of the formidable warrior he would become. However, the war's decisive engagement would take place in the south of England, where the strategic advantages initially favored the baronial forces. The Battle of Lewes, fought in Sussex on May 14, 1264, would prove to be one of the most significant defeats in Edward's early military career. Despite his personal courage and the effectiveness of the cavalry charge he led on the right wing of his father's army, the overall battle was lost when de Montfort's forces managed to exploit their advantageous position on the high ground of Offham Hill. The aftermath of Lewes was catastrophic for the royal cause. Edward was taken prisoner and held under close confinement, while his father was forced to accept humiliating terms that essentially made Simon de Montfort the uncrowned ruler of England. For nearly a year, de Montfort exercised almost kingly authority, governing in Henry's name while keeping both the king and his heir under strict control. This period of captivity was undoubtedly one of the most difficult and formative experiences of Edward's youth. The future king was forced to watch helplessly as his family's authority was usurped by subjects who had taken up arms against their lawful sovereign. The experience instilled in him a deep appreciation for the importance of military strength and political vigilance in maintaining royal authority. Edward's escape from captivity in 1265 marked the turning point of the Second Barons' War. The prince managed to slip away from his captors and began the process of rebuilding a royalist army in the Welsh Marches, the borderlands between England and Wales, where royal authority remained strong. With his father still held prisoner by de Montfort, Edward effectively became the leader of the royal cause and the focus of loyalist hopes for restoration. The campaign that followed demonstrated Edward's remarkable abilities as both a military strategist and a political leader. Throughout the summer of 1265, he systematically reclaimed much of northern and western England for the royal cause, building a coalition of supporters who were motivated both by loyalty to the crown and by opposition to de Montfort's increasingly autocratic rule. The climactic engagement came at the Battle of Evesham on August 4, 1265, where Edward's tactical brilliance secured a crushing victory over de Montfort's forces. The prince had managed to outmaneuver his opponent before the battle even began, trapping de Montfort in an unfavorable position where the baronial leader was forced to fight. The resulting clash was overwhelmingly one-sided, with de Montfort himself killed in the fighting and King Henry finally freed from captivity. The victory at Evesham established Edward's reputation as one of England's most capable military commanders. He had not only rescued his father and restored royal authority, but had done so through his own strategic and tactical skills. The success marked his emergence as a major political figure in his own right and demonstrated that he possessed the military abilities that would be essential for effective medieval kingship. However, the end of the Second Barons' War did not bring immediate peace to England. Scattered resistance continued throughout 1265 and into 1266. Requiring sustained military effort to fully suppress. Edward continued to play a leading role in these operations, gaining valuable experience in the complex task of pacifying a recently rebellious population. The siege of Kenilworth Castle proved particularly challenging, lasting from the summer of 1266 until December. Edward participated in these operations during the summer months, helping to maintain pressure on the garrison while negotiations continued for a peaceful resolution. The eventual surrender of the castle marked the effective end of organized resistance to royal authority in the aftermath of victory. Edward was instrumental in implementing policies designed to reconcile the former rebels with the crown. The Dictum of Kenilworth, issued in October 1266, established terms under which those who had fought against the king could repurchase their confiscated land. This policy of reconciliation, rather than revenge, helped to heal the divisions that had torn England apart during the Civil War. The final phases of the conflict saw Edward leading operations against remaining pockets of resistance throughout the realm. His campaign in the Isle of Ely in the summer of 1267 successfully cleared out the last significant group of rebels, bringing the long period of civil strife to a definitive conclusion. The settlement that followed the end of the Second Barons' War reflected both the crown's victory and the need for political reconciliation. The Statute of Marlborough, issued in November 1267, incorporated many of the legal and fiscal reforms that the barons had originally demanded, but this time with royal consent rather than as concessions forced upon an unwilling monarch. Edward's role in these post-war arrangements remains somewhat unclear from the historical record. While he had been the key military leader in securing victory for the royal cause, his specific contributions to the political settlement are less well documented. What is clear is that he emerged from the conflict with enhanced status and substantial new estates confiscated from defeated rebels. The years following the Civil War provided Edward with valuable experience in the peacetime administration of the realm. However, his exact role in day-to-day governance during the late 1260s remains somewhat ambiguous. While he clearly participated in royal councils and received extensive lands as rewards for his military service, he did not appear to exercise the level of influence that his crucial role in ending war might have suggested. Various disputes arose involving Edward during this period, including conflicts with other nobles over territorial jurisdictions and administrative responsibilities. These disagreements provided additional lessons in the complexities of medieval governance and the importance of managing relationships with powerful subjects. Despite his father's advancing age and the valuable experience Edward had gained during the Civil War, the prince began formulating plans for a very different kind of adventure in the late 1260s. The idea of joining a crusade to the Holy Land had captured his imagination, representing both a spiritual calling and an opportunity for martial glory that appealed to his developing sense of chivalric duty. The Crusades had been a defining feature of European Christianity since the late 11th century, when Pope Urban II had first called upon the knights of Christendom to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The First Crusade had achieved remarkable success, establishing several Crusader states in the Levant that had endured for nearly 2 centuries. However, by Edward's time, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was in severe decline. The great Muslim leader Saladin had recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, and despite the efforts of subsequent crusades, including the famous Third Crusade led by Edward's great-uncle, Richard the Lionheart, the Christian territories had continued to shrink under pressure from successive Muslim rulers. The immediate threat that motivated Edward's crusading plans came from the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, whose forces had been systematically reducing the remaining Crusader strongholds throughout the 1260s. When Pope Gregory X called for a new crusade in response to this threat, several European rulers pledged to take the cross and journey to the Holy Land. King Louis IX of France and his sons were among the first to commit to the venture, creating both an opportunity and an obligation for Edward to participate on England's behalf. The prospect of campaigning alongside the flower of European chivalry in the service of Christendom held enormous appeal for a young prince who had already proven his military abilities in domestic conflicts. However, organizing and financing such an expedition presented enormous challenges. The costs involved in transporting, equipping, and maintaining an army in the distant Holy Land were staggering, requiring careful planning and substantial financial resources. Edward bore much of this burden personally through his own household revenues, demonstrating both his commitment to the venture and the considerable wealth his victories in the Civil War had brought him. Approximately 225 knights agreed to accompany Edward on his crusade, supplemented by several hundred additional troops and support personnel. Most of these men were drawn from the royalist forces that had fought under Edward's command during the Second Barons' War, creating a strong foundation of loyalty and shared experience within the expedition. Notably, many of the nobles who had only recently reconciled with the crown after supporting the baronial cause showed little enthusiasm for joining the royal expedition. This reluctance reflected both the financial burdens involved and perhaps some lingering political tensions from the recent conflict. The resulting crusading army that departed England in the summer of 1270 was relatively modest by historical standards, particularly when compared to some of the great expeditions of earlier centuries. Recruitment had proven more difficult than expected, and the financial arrangements remained precarious, despite substantial borrowing from King Louis IX of France. The expedition's troubles began almost immediately upon reaching the Mediterranean, when Edward's forces finally caught up with the much larger French contingent at Tunis in North Africa during the autumn of 1270. They received devastating news. King Louis IX had died of dysentery several weeks earlier, depriving the crusade of its most important leader and patron. The death of the French king created an immediate crisis for the entire expedition. Charles of Anjou, who had assumed leadership of the French forces, quickly entered into negotiations with the Emir of Tunis that resulted in the diversion of the crusade to Sicily, rather than continuing to the Holy Land as originally planned. Edward was outraged by this development, viewing it as a betrayal of the crusading vows that had brought them all to Africa. Rather than acquiescing to the new plan, he elected to continue with his own smaller force along the original route toward the Holy Land, demonstrating the determination and independence that would characterize his entire career. The English contingent's arrival at the Crusader stronghold of Acre in mid-May 1271 marked the beginning of what historians would later call Lord Edward's Crusade, or the Ninth Crusade. The immediate strategic situation was precarious, with Sultan Baybars maintaining pressure on the remaining Christian territories while possessing forces far superior to anything Edward could field. Contemporary sources disagree about the immediate impact of Edward's arrival. Some Christian accounts suggest that his presence helped deter an immediate assault on Acre, while Arab sources are much less impressed by the English contribution to the city's defense. What seems clear is that Baybars possessed the strength to take Acre if he had chosen to press a sustained siege. Edward's forces spent more than 6 weeks confined to Acre before finally attempting their first significant operation. The expedition to St. George de la Bean, approximately 25 kilometers from Acre, was hampered by the brutal summer heat and problems with food supplies that prevented any further advance. A subsequent campaign against Cochin, about 6 kilometers from Acre, achieved greater success during the early winter months. Edward's forces managed to defeat a Muslim army in the field outside the town, demonstrating that the English could hold their own in combat against their opponents. However, the expedition lacked the strength to capture the main citadel, forcing them to retreat to Acre once again. The fundamental problem facing Edward's crusade was simply one of resources. The handful of surviving Crusader states lacked the strength to support major offensive operations, leaving Edward with little choice but to accept the limitations of his situation. King, earlier than Edward, negotiating a 10-year truce with Baybars in the early summer of 1272. The Cypriot king's decision reflected both the military realities of the situation and an opportunity presented by Mongol raids into the region that temporarily threatened Baybar's rear areas. Edward initially opposed this truce, hoping to continue active operations despite the unfavorable odds. However, he gradually came to accept that little more could be accomplished with the forces at his disposal. The most significant incident during his remaining time in the Holy Land occurred when he was attacked in his bedchamber by an assassin, possibly sent by Baybars or by the mysterious old man of the mountains. According to some accounts, his wife Eleanor saved his life by sucking the poison from the wound, though the accuracy of this romantic detail remains questionable. Holy Land had become untenable. Edward departed the Holy Land in September 1272, leaving behind a Crusader presence that was clearly living on borrowed time. His crusade had achieved little in strategic terms, but it had enhanced his reputation for personal courage and demonstrated his commitment to the chivalric ideals that were central to medieval kingship. The journey home proved eventful in its own right. While traveling through southern Italy in early 1273, Edward received word that his father had died the previous November, making him King of England. However, rather than rushing home to claim his inheritance, Edward chose to continue his leisurely progress through Italy and France, demonstrating a confidence in the stability of his realm that would prove well-founded. The new king's decision to visit Paris and pay homage to the French king for his continental possessions. Edward then spent time in Gascony. In August 1274 came nearly 2 years after his father's death, but the kingdom had remained stable under the regency government throughout his absence. This remarkable period of continuity reflected both the strength of English administrative institutions and the widespread acceptance of months preceding his return, allowing the ceremony to take place just over 2 weeks after his landing. The coronation on August 19, 1274, was notable for being the first since the Norman conquest to include both a king and queen, figure who would transform England and much of the British Isles over the following decade. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, at a time when few men reached 6 feet, Edward had acquired the nickname Longshanks that would follow him throughout history. Edward's physical presence was matched by a strong personality that combined determination with occasional fits of violent temper. His religious convictions were orthodox but not excessive, and while he was not particularly scholarly, he showed genuine appreciation for architecture and the arts. Most importantly, Edward possessed a clarity of purpose and an understanding of power that had been largely absent from English kingship since the days of Richard the Lionheart over 70 years earlier. The new king would soon demonstrate that he intended to restore England's position as a major European power and to complete the unfinished business of creating a truly unified British kingdom under English rule. As he settled into his new role as king, Edward would face challenges that would test every aspect of his character and abilities. The conquered territories of Wales had begun asserting their independence during the weakness of his father's reign. Scotland remained a complex neighbor whose relationship with England required careful management, and France continued to pose both opportunities and threats to English interests. The reign that followed would see Edward earn both admiration and hatred. Significant and controversial monarch. The young prince, who had learned the arts of war and statecraft, King of England, and leave an indelible mark on the history of the British Isles. The first major challenge confronting Edward as king came from the mountainous lands to the west, royal leadership. The situation in Wales represented both an immediate threat to English security and an opportunity for Edward to demonstrate the restored strength of the English crown. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 had been followed by a gradual extension of Norman power into Wales, with the new rulers establishing a network of castles and lordships along the Welsh borders. Throughout the 12th century, English influence in Wales had grown considerably, with many Welsh rulers accepting various degrees of overlordship from the English crown. However, the political turmoil that had characterized England during the reigns of King John and Henry III had provided opportunities for Welsh resurgence. The most successful of the Welsh leaders had been Llywelyn ap Griffith, who had exploited England's domestic difficulties to rebuild Welsh. Position had strengthened considerably by the 1270s under Edward's dynamic leadership. The Welsh prince's refusal to pay homage to the new English king represented a direct challenge to royal authority of English territory in the March. the borderlands between England and Wales. Edward viewed this not as the action of an independent foreign prince. This interpretation reflected Edward's broader understanding of the relationship between England and its Celtic neighbors. Edward's response demonstrated both his military capabilities and his strategic thinking. Invasion. He spent time building a coalition of Welsh princes who had grown resentful of Llywelyn's dominance. Several Welsh rulers had sought refuge at the English court, providing Edward with allies who could legitimize his intervention. The campaign that began in the summer of 1277 was a masterpiece of medieval logistics and strategy. Edward assembled a royal army of approximately 15,000 men, supported by a fleet that could maintain supply lines and prevent escape by sea. This overwhelming display of English power achieved its objectives without requiring a major battle faced. With such superior forces, Llywelyn quickly recognized that resistance was futile. The Treaty of Aberconwy that ended the First Welsh War severely curtailed the English crown. The swift and decisive nature of Edward's victory re-established English dominance in Wales and demonstrated. Welsh war erupted when Llywelyn's brother David launched attacks on English castles in the region. This second conflict differed significantly from the first, as Edward now faced a coalition of Welsh princes. Edward had failed to adequately reward those Welsh princes who had supported him in 1277, while English administration had proven heavy-handed and insensitive to Welsh customs and traditions. The result was a much more widespread and determined resistance than Edward had faced during his first Welsh campaign. Edward's response to this renewed challenge was characteristically determined and systematic. He again assembled a large army and implemented a strategy designed to isolate the main Welsh strongholds in Snowdonia. The campaign's turning point came in December 1282, when Llywelyn was killed in action at Irfinbridge while attempting to break out of the English existed for centuries. His brother David attempted to continue the resistance, but without Llywelyn's leadership and charisma, the Welsh cause quickly collapsed. The last Welsh strongholds surrendered in April 1283, and David himself was captured and executed, effectively ending organized Welsh resistance. Edward's settlement of Wales following his victories was both comprehensive and harsh. The Statute of Wales, passed in 1284, extended English systems of government throughout the conquered territories. New English-style counties were created, and English law replaced traditional Welsh legal customs in many areas. The process of Anglicization extended beyond legal and administrative changes to include extensive demographic alteration. Many Welsh nobles were dispossessed of their lands, which were then granted to English followers of Edward. This policy created a new ruling class in Wales that was entirely dependent on English royal favor and committed to maintaining English control. Perhaps the most visible symbol of English domination was the extensive castle-building program that Edward initiated throughout Wales. Massive new fortifications arose at sites like Conway, Carnarvon, and Harlech, representing the most advanced military architecture of the age. These castles served both practical defensive purposes and symbolic functions. By the establishment of new English-style towns at many of the same locations, these settlements were populated primarily by English colonists and served as centers of English administration and commerce. Future rebellion impossible. Despite these extensive measures, Edward did not completely pacify Wales during his reign. Significant rebellions erupted in 1287 and again in 1294. Welsh resistance to English rule remained strong despite the comprehensive nature of Edward's conquest. The financial cost of these Welsh campaigns was enormous, with the crown spending approximately £55,000 to suppress the 1294 rebellion alone. This massive expenditure highlighted both the determination of Welsh resistance and the challenges Edward faced in maintaining control over his expanded realm. The enormous costs associated with Edward's military campaigns in Wales and elsewhere necessitated comprehensive reforms to England's financial and administrative system. The new king recognized that the ambitions he harbored for English expansion could only be achieved if the realm possessed the fiscal resources and governmental efficiency necessary to support sustained military efforts. One of Edward's first major appointments as king was Robert Burnell as Chancellor of the Exchequer, a close ally who would oversee the implementation of sweeping administrative reforms. Burnell immediately announced a commission of inquiry designed to investigate lost through poor record-keeping or deliberate concealment. Though the results of this inquiry were mixed, it provided valuable information that influenced the creation of the extensive Statutes of Westminster, promulgated in the spring of 1275. This represented the first of several legislative acts extending through 1290 that sought to eliminate abuses in land tenure and prevent the subinfeudation practices that had deprived lords of their rightful feudal dues. The new legislation also addressed the rights of tenants, while restricting the ability of the church and other institutions to grant away lands without royal approval. This ensured that the crown would receive appropriate income from such transactions and helped prevent the erosion of royal revenues that had occurred during previous reigns. These legal reforms constituted major changes to crown finances, land practices, and debt management in medieval England. The comprehensive nature of the legislation demonstrated Edward's commitment to creating a more efficient and profitable governmental system that could support his military ambitions. While the inquiry of 1274 and the resulting Statutes of Westminster began the process of financial reform, additional measures were needed to address the crown's immediate fiscal needs. In 1275, and even this modest customs duty generated approximately £10,000 annually for Edward's This new revenue stream provided a reliable foundation for royal finances that would prove crucial in funding future military campaigns. Supplementing the wool customs was a one-time tax of 1/15 of the value of movable goods, essentially a medieval wealth tax that yielded upwards of comprehensive reforms to the operation of the exchequer itself. While the church also faced additional taxation from 1279 onwards, the same year saw Wedwa undertake a recoinage of the realm's currency, a measure designed both to remove forged coins from circulation and to provide the crown with additional revenue through the reissue of new currency. Such monetary reforms were necessary on a regular basis during an era when coin values depended largely on their silver content rather than governmental guarantees. Despite the broad success of these financial reforms, they still proved insufficient to meet the costs of Edward's ambitious military program. When renewed unrest erupted in Wales during the early 1280s, the shortfall was addressed through loans from wealthy merchant communities in England's major town. Regional assemblies were convened in early 1283 to approve additional taxation in northern England and other districts. Edward also turned to international banking, particularly the Italian merchant banking families such as the Riccardi, whose financial networks extended across much of Western and Central Europe by the late 13th century. These arrangements demonstrated both the growing sophistication of medieval finance and the international scope of Edward's ambitions. The reliance on emergency funding measures revealed that despite the effectiveness of the 1270s reforms, England still lacked the fiscal capacity to sustain major. This recognition led to further administrative reforms during the 1280s, notably the Statute of Rhuddlan, which aimed to improve record-keeping and reduce the corruption that was endemic in pre-modern governmental systems. These continuing reforms ultimately achieved significant improvements in the efficiency of English administration during Edward's reign. The governmental apparatus that emerged from these changes was considerably more capable of exploiting the kingdom's resources for royal purposes, creating the foundation for England's later emergence as a major European power. Edward's reign witnessed crucial developments in the evolution of the English parliamentary system. While modern observers often point to the Magna Carta as the great constitutional achievement of the High Middle Ages, this perspective tends to overstate that document's immediate significance, while underestimating the more substantive parliamentary innovations that occurred during Edward's reign. The Magna Carta had primarily addressed the relationship between the crown and the nobility class. However, the more significant developments in parliamentary government actually began to take shape under Edward's leadership, establishing precedents that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. Edward oversaw the development of the system whereby parliamentary representatives were chosen, a process that would continue largely unchanged into the modern era. The new arrangements specified that 2 knights should be returned to Parliament from every county and to burgesses from every incorporated town, creating a system of national representation for the first time in English history. This innovation presaged the constituency-based electoral system that most modern democracies would eventually adopt. By establishing regular representation for both rural and urban interests, realm rather than merely the great noble families. In addition to these structural innovations, Edward established the important precedent in his first Parliament of 1275 of requesting parliamentary permission for extraordinary taxation. This development was designed to avoid the constitutional conflicts that had plagued his father's and grandfather's reign, dominated much of the 13th century. Through these measures, Edward created a reciprocal relationship between crown and parliament that would prove remarkably durable. The monarch could request taxes and military service from parliament, while the parliamentary representatives could present grievances and request reforms in return. This system operated effectively until the constitutional crisis of the 17th century. The parliamentary developments during Edward's reign represented a crucial step in the evolution of English constitutional government. By establishing regular consultation with representatives of the realm and creating mechanisms for peaceful resolution of conflicts between crown and subjects, Edward contributed significantly to England's gradual development toward more representative government. Edward's reign also witnessed significant developments in Ireland and controversial policies regarding England's Jewish population that would have lasting consequences for both territories. Although events in Ireland receive relatively little attention in most accounts of Edward's reign. There were substantial developments there during his 4 decades in power. Much of Ireland had been first conquered by English forces in the late 12th century, though significant portions of the island remained outside English control and continued to be ruled by native Irish kings and lords. English expansion in Ireland continued during Edward's reign, driven largely by the initiative of English settlers already established there rather than by direct royal intervention. However, 2 particular measures deserve attention for their long-term significance in the development of English rule in Ireland. In 1292, Edward initiated a lay subsidy tax in Ireland, which was used in subsequent years to fund the establishment of a new Irish Parliament with elected representatives. This Parliament met officially for the first time in 1297 and would continue to function for over 5 centuries until the Act of Union merged the Irish Parliament with the English Parliament at Westminster in 1801. Alongside these parliamentary developments, Edward's reign saw substantial strengthening and expansion of the court system in Ireland. Centralized courts were established in Dublin, while regional courts were created in the provinces to dispense justice under English common law. These judicial reforms helped consolidate English control while providing more consistent legal procedures throughout the English-controlled portions of Ireland. As a result of these administrative and legal improvements, Ireland generated substantial profits for the English exchequer by the end of Edward's reign. English political commentators, writing during the early modern period, would look back over 250 years and identify the early 14th century as the height of successful English rule in Ireland. However, Edward's reign also witnessed one of the most shameful episodes in medieval English history: the systematic persecution and eventual expulsion of England's Jewish community. A substantial Jewish population had developed in England during the late 11th and 12th centuries, filling an important economic role as moneylenders, since Christian religious law forbade Christians from practicing usury. By the early 12th century, England's Jewish community had become significant contributors to the country's economic life, providing financial services that were essential to commerce and development. However, their economic prominence coincided with growing anti-Semitic attitudes among the Christian population. Medieval Christians widely believed that Jewish people bore collective guilt for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, viewing them as responsible for deicide. This religious prejudice, combined with resentment over the money-lending activities that had made many Jewish families wealthy, led to increasing persecution during Edward's father's reign. Henry III had imposed heavy, extraordinary taxes, specifically targeting Jewish communities, and had applied considerable pressure encouraging conversion to Christianity. Edward dramatically escalated these anti-Semitic policies immediately upon becoming king. In 1275, Edward issued the Statute of Jewry, which prohibited Jewish people from practicing moneylending, effectively destroying their primary means of livelihood. The statute also confined Jewish families to ghettos in certain towns and cities, and required all Jewish people over 7 years of age to wear yellow badges, identifying them as Jewish. Additional taxes were imposed specifically on Jewish people over 12 years of age, creating a discriminatory tax burden that applied to no other group within the realm. These extraordinarily punitive measures remained in effect for 15 years, systematically impoverishing and marginalizing England's Jewish population. In 1290, Edward determined that these persecutory measures had not achieved their intended goals, as many Jewish families continued to engage in money-lending activities despite the legal prohibitions. His response was to order the complete expulsion of Jewish people from England, making England one of the first European kingdoms to implement such a comprehensive policy of ethnic cleansing. The expulsion was carried out with brutal efficiency, with perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 Jewish people forced to leave England during the early 1290s. Many sought refuge in Eastern Europe, where religious tolerance was greater and Jewish communities were more welcome. A small number remained in England by disguising themselves as Italian bankers, but the great majority were forced to abandon their homes and businesses. The expulsion provided Edward with the additional benefit of allowing him to confiscate Jewish properties and lands, which were then sold to provide additional revenue for the crown. This financial windfall helped fund his continental campaigns, while simultaneously removing what he apparently viewed as an unwanted population from his realm. This shameful episode in Edward's reign demonstrates the limitations of medieval concepts of justice and tolerance. While Edward showed considerable skill in managing relationships with his Christian subjects and neighboring kingdoms, his treatment of England's Jewish community reflected the religious prejudices and economic opportunism that characterized much of medieval European society. Like each of his predecessors, Edward maintained significant interests in continental Europe, though his approach differed considerably from that of earlier English kings. His father had reached agreements with France during the 1250s that effectively accepted the loss of England's extensive northern French territories, particularly the Duchy of Normandy that King John had lost in the early 1200s. This diplomatic settlement meant that Edward was not under the same pressure to attempt the reconquest of Normandy and other lost territories that had consumed the energies of earlier English monarchs. Nevertheless, England retained substantial continental possessions, particularly the Duchy of Gascony in southwestern France, and these territories necessarily involved Edward in French politics. Edward visited Gascony on several occasions, often launching reform campaigns designed to improve the administration of these distant territories. His most comprehensive effort came in the late 1280s, resulting in major administrative reforms agreed upon in 1289 that sought to regulate the conduct of English officials in Gascony, particularly the seneschal, who served as Edward's chief representative in the region. However, the fundamental problem with England's continental possessions lay in their feudal status. Edward held Gascony not as an independent sovereign, but as a vassal of the French king, a relationship that created potential for conflict whenever disputes arose between English and French interests. Edward had maintained generally good relations with King Philip III of France, who had succeeded his father, Louis IX, following the latter's death at Tunis during the Crusade of 1270. Edward had paid homage to Philip during his return journey from the Holy Land in the mid-1270s, and had visited Paris again in 1279 to resolve outstanding differences between the two crowns. Relations with Philip's successor, Philip IV, who became king in 1285, initially continued on the same positive trajectory. This makes the outbreak of war between England and France in the 1290s somewhat surprising, particularly given the generally cordial personal relationship between the two monarchs. The conflict originated in a localized dispute between English and French merchant sailors operating in the English Channel. Edward believed his actions against these French merchants were entirely justified in his capacity as King of England. But Philip IV viewed them as acts of rebellion by Edward in his role as Duke of Gascony, and therefore a vassal of France. This confusion over Edward's dual status as both an equal sovereign king and a subordinate feudal vassal created the legal and political framework for the war that erupted in 1294. Edward found himself in the impossible position of being simultaneously a fellow monarch equal to the French king and a subject required to answer to French royal authority. After initial naval engagements in the English Channel, Philip summoned Edward to Paris to account for his actions. Edward, unwilling to appear before a fellow sovereign in such a subordinate capacity, sent his brother Edmund as his representative instead of appearing personally. A compromise arrangement was initially reached, whereby Edward would temporarily surrender certain minor fortresses in Gascony as security, while Edward would marry Philip's sister Margaret, a woman nearly 40 years younger than the English king. This marriage alliance was intended to resolve the disputes that had arisen in the Channel, while cementing a new relationship between the two royal houses. Edward's first wife Eleanor had died in 1290 after 36 years of marriage, making him available for remarriage as a diplomatic tool. However, the entire arrangement proved to be an elaborate deception on Philip's part, designed to trick Edward into surrendering key strongholds that could then be permanently confiscated. When the Parliament of Paris voted to confiscate the entire Duchy of Gascony from Edward, the pretense of peaceful resolution was abandoned and outright war began. Edward's response included a renewed assertion of his claims to territories that had been lost by his predecessors 90 years earlier, dramatically expanding the scope of the conflict. Edward's strategy for the resulting war demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his understanding of continental politics. Rather than attempting to defend Gascony directly, which would have been difficult given its distance from England and the strength of French forces in the region, Edward sought to build a grand alliance of continental powers against France. Particularly important to this strategy were the numerous small principalities of the Low Countries and Western Germany, which were divided into dozens of independent dukedoms, counties, and city-states during the late medieval period. Edward also sought alliance with the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who controlled extensive territories in eastern France. Through these alliances, Edward hoped to create a power base in the Low Countries, centered around the Duchy of Brabant and the counties of Gelders and Holland. This would allow English forces to strike into northeastern France toward Paris rather than operating from the distant and vulnerable base of Gascony. The implementation of this strategy was delayed until 1297, by which time English forces had experienced mixed results in their direct confrontations with French armies in Gascony. When the Low Countries campaign finally began, it proved to be a costly failure from which Edward barely managed to extricate himself in the spring of 3298. The failure of Edward's continental alliance marked the end of the most intensive period of the French War, though achieving a final peace settlement proved difficult and time-consuming. A truce was negotiated late in 1297. But it took several more years to work out the details of a permanent settlement. In 1299, the previously arranged marriage between Edward and Philip's sister Margaret finally took place, despite the 40-year age difference between the couple, the marriage proved reasonably satisfactory for both parties. Margaret bore Edward 2 sons and a daughter, and she chose never to remarry after Edward's death several years later. The final peace terms between England and France were eventually finalized in 1303, essentially returning to the status quo that had existed before the war began. The conflict had proven enormously expensive for both sides without achieving significant changes in the balance of power between the two kingdoms. Military operations in Gascony alone had cost Edward's exchequer approximately £350,000, while over £150,000 was paid to various small states in the Low Countries and Germany to secure their alliance, with virtually no benefit to show for these enormous expenditures. The massive cost of the war meant that a formal coronation for Margaret was never held due to the expense involved. This costly and ultimately unsuccessful continental adventure proved particularly frustrating for Edward because it diverted resources and attention from what had become his primary foreign policy objective, the conquest of Scotland. The opportunity that would define the final decades of Edward's reign arose from a succession crisis in Scotland that began in 1286. King Alexander III died that year, leaving his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, as his heir. However, Margaret's death in 1290 brought the direct royal line to an end and created a disputed succession that would dramatically alter the relationship between England and Scotland. More than a dozen contenders emerged with claims to the Scottish throne, but the two most serious candidates were Robert Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway. To prevent civil war, the Scottish Council of Guardians that had been governing during Margaret's minority appealed to Edward to serve as arbitrator in the succession dispute. Edward viewed this request as an opportunity to reassert English influence over Scottish affairs that had been largely dormant since the late 11th century. Like his approach to Wales, Edward considered Scotland to be a subordinate kingdom that owed allegiance to England rather than a fully independent realm. This perspective reflected Edward's understanding of the historical relationship between England and Scotland since the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror and his successors had established varying degrees of overlordship over the northern kingdom, though this control had weakened considerably during the century preceding Edward's accession. After supporting John Balliol's successful claim to the Scottish throne in 1292, Edward made it clear that he expected the new King John I to serve as his vassal and that Scotland should function as a subject kingdom under English overlordship. However, Balliol and the Scottish political community proved unwilling to accept this subordinate status. The immediate crisis came when war broke out between England and France in 1294. Edward expected Scottish military support for his continental campaigns, but Balliol not only refused to provide troops but actually entered into negotiations with the French to form an alliance against England. This Scottish-French cooperation represented a direct challenge to Edward's authority and provided the justification for his decision to invade and occupy Scotland in 1296. The campaign that followed would establish Edward's reputation as the Hammer of the Scots, while beginning a conflict that would continue for over 30 years. Edward ordered his army to assemble at Newcastle upon Tyne in March 1296, while simultaneously sending envoys north with demands that the Scots surrender the border castles of Roxburgh, Jedburgh, and Berwick as security against any potential French alliance. The Scottish refusal of these demands, combined with a Scottish attack on Carlisle Castle led by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, provided Edward with the pretext he needed for full-scale invasion. The ease with which Edward's forces crossed into Scotland and captured Berwick demonstrated the weakness of Scottish resistance to English military power. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Dunbar on April 27, 1296, where Edward's forces, led by John de Warenne, comprehensively defeated the Scottish army, led by John Comyn. Although the battle involved relatively small cavalry forces on both sides, the English victory was overwhelming, with approximately 100 Scottish nobles and knights taken prisoner following the collapse of Scottish resistance at Dunbar. Major castles throughout lowland Scotland surrendered to Edward's advancing forces. Edinburgh Castle held out briefly but fell after a week-long siege, completing what had been a remarkably swift and decisive campaign. King John Balliol's surrender and subsequent humiliation marked the effective end of Scottish independence for the next decade. Edward had Balliol stripped of his royal insignia and sent south to captivity in England, while the Stone of Scone, the traditional coronation stone of Scottish kings, was removed to Westminster Abbey as a symbol of English supremacy. In the aftermath of his victory, Edward established English administration throughout Scotland, with English garrisons placed at key strategic locations and English officials appointed to govern the conquered kingdom. This comprehensive occupation seemed to have achieved Edward's goal of incorporating Scotland into his expanding realm. However, the ease of Edward's initial victory proved deceptive, as Scottish resistance had been temporarily crushed rather than permanently eliminated. When Edward became preoccupied with his French wars, the opportunity arose for a new Scottish revolt that would prove far more challenging than the brief campaign of 1296. The rebellion that erupted in 1297 was led by three key figures who would become central to the Scottish independence struggle. Robert Bruce, grandson of the earlier claimant to the Scottish throne, represented the continuing ambitions of his family. Andrew de Moray emerged as a leader in northeastern Scotland, while Sir William Wallace became the most famous of the rebel commanders. Despite later romanticized portrayals, Wallace was actually a member of the lesser Scottish nobility rather than a common man rising against oppression. The three leaders initially operated independently but gradually coordinated their efforts to create a nationwide resistance movement. The rebels achieved their first major success at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297, where they inflicted a significant defeat on English forces. Andrew de Moray was fatally wounded in this engagement, leaving Wallace as the primary leader of the Scottish cause and leading to his selection as Guardian of Scotland. Edward was unable to respond immediately to this setback due to his commitments in the Low Countries and domestic unrest in England itself. The nobility and church leaders had grown increasingly critical of the costs of Edward's wars and his failure to properly consult with them about taxation and military service. The king addressed these domestic concerns through a combination of justification and concession, arguing that his harsh policies were necessary to bring the wars to a swift conclusion, while promising that the extraordinary demands would not be repeated. The Scottish raids into northern England following Stirling Bridge actually helped Edward's cause by convincing many English nobles that his requests for support were justified by genuine emergencies. Edward's return to England in the spring of 1298 allowed him to organize a major response to the Scottish rebellion. The army he assembled numbered over 20,000 troops, including substantial numbers of Welsh infantry pressed into service to demonstrate their loyalty after recent revolts. The resulting Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, demonstrated Edward's tactical brilliance and the effectiveness of English military method. Although the Scottish forces formed effective defensive formations using long spears arranged in schiltrons, Edward's cavalry managed to hold these formations in place while English archers and crossbowmen decimated the trapped Scottish infantry. The victory at Falkirk re-established Edward's military reputation and eliminated Wallace as an effective leader of Scottish resistance. However, Edward proved unable to capitalize fully on his success due to continuing commitments elsewhere and the Scottish adoption of guerrilla tactics that avoided direct confrontation with English armies. The conflict continued throughout the early 1300s, with Edward mounting annual campaigns into Scotland, but finding it difficult to achieve decisive results against enemies who refused to fight conventional battles. The situation gradually improved for the English cause through diplomacy and division among the Scottish leadership. Robert Bruce was won over to Edward's side in 1302, while the end of the French War in 1303 eliminated any hope of external support for the Scottish cause. Many Scottish nobles eventually came to terms with Edward after the English retook Stirling Castle, and the capture of William Wallace near Glasgow in 1305 seemed to mark the final end of organized resistance. Wallace's execution in London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield, was intended to serve as a warning to any other potential rebels. Edward moved to consolidate his control over Scotland by appointing his nephew John of Brittany as royal lieutenant, while installing English officials throughout the Scottish administrative system. The appointment of English judges to Scottish courts and the initiation of a review designed to align Scottish law with English common law demonstrated symbolic gestures, such as referring to Scotland as a land rather than a kingdom in official correspondence, emphasized the subordinate status Edward intended to impose. However, Edward's apparent victory in 1305 proved as ephemeral as his earlier success in 1296. The murder of Robert Comyn by Robert Bruce at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries in February 1306 eliminated the last alternative claimant to the Scottish throne and cleared the way for Bruce to claim the crown for himself. Bruce's coronation at Scone 5 weeks later, performed with royal robes brought out of hiding and conducted at the traditional site of Scottish royal inaugurations, marked the beginning of a new phase of Scottish resistance that would ultimately prove successful. Edward's response to this latest challenge, by now approaching 70, the king was suffering from declining health that limited his ability to campaign personally. Earl of Pembroke and Henry Percy, while a separate force was placed under the command of the Prince of Wales. The future Edward II. Edward's own vindictive reaction to Bruce's rebellion included the execution of prominent Scots residing in England for their tenuous connections to the new Scottish king. The early phases of Bruce's campaign went badly. Bruce himself barely escaped capture at Methven after Amer de Valence violated a truce agreement, and several of Bruce's brothers and supporters were captured and executed. However, Bruce managed to survive the winter of 1306 to 1307 by building support in the Gaelic regions of western Scotland and possibly visiting Ireland to gather additional resources. His return to the Scottish mainland in the spring of 1307 from earlier defeats and developed effective tactics for confronting English forces. The latter battle was particularly significant, as Bruce's smaller army managed to defeat Aymer de Valence's much larger force through superior use of terrain and tactic. Edward's fury at these new setbacks led him to make one final attempt to personally lead a campaign into Scotland despite his deteriorating health. However, the old king's body could no longer sustain the demands of active campaigning, and he fell ill with dysentery while advancing toward the Scottish border. Edward I died at Berg by Sands, just south of the Scottish frontier, on the morning of July 7, 1307, according to tradition. That much of his life's work remained incomplete and possibly facing failure. Scotland had acquired a new king after a decade of English rule, and Bruce had recently won several victories that suggested the English position might be fundamentally vulnerable. Edward's death marked the end of an era in English history and the beginning of a period of crisis that would test all the institutions and achievements of his long reign. His son and successor faced the enormous challenge of maintaining English power while dealing with the complex. The ultimate success of his policies remained uncertain at the time of his death. His reign had restored English military prestige, created new governmental institutions, and expanded English territorial control. King's body was embalmed and brought south for burial, lying in state at Waltham Abbey before final interment at Westminster Abbey on October 27, 1308, nearly 4 months after his death. His tomb was fashioned from plain Purbeck limestone without ornate decoration or royal effigy, possibly due to the financial constraints created by his expensive wars. In 1774, the Royal Society of Antiquaries had Edward's tomb opened, discovering that his body remained well preserved after more than 4 centuries. An inscription added in the mid-16th century by the last, by which Edward has subsequently been known. This epithet reflects both the manner in which the Scottish Wars came to define his reign and the ultimate failure of his efforts to permanently subjugate Scotland. Despite his military successes and comprehensive administrative reforms, Edward was unable to complete the conquest that would have unified the British Isles under English rule. Nevertheless, he reformed and revitalized crown government after decades of civil war and weak leadership, reconquered much of Wales through extensive military campaigns, and established administrative and legal precedents that would influence, establishing patterns of consultation between crown and realm that would survive until the constitutional crisis of the 17th century. Common law that would eventually spread to many parts of the world through imperial expansion. Edward's reign also witnessed important cultural development, including the growing use of English rather than French in government and the courts. These changes reflected and encouraged the emergence of a more unified English national identity that would prove crucial in later conflicts with France and other continental powers. However, the enormous costs of Edward's military campaigns left England in serious financial difficulty at the time of his death. The elaborate castle-building programs in Wales and the extended campaigns in Scotland had consumed vast resources while generating limited additional revenue for the crown. The king's treatment of England's Jewish community represents one of the most shameful aspects of his reign, demonstrating the limitations of medieval concepts of justice and tolerance. The expulsion of 1290 reflected both religious prejudice and financial opportunism, while eliminating a community that had contributed significantly to English economic development. Edward's failure to complete the conquest of Scotland would have lasting consequences for English policy and British development. The Scottish Wars would continue for decades after his death, consuming resources and attention that might have been directed toward other opportunities for expansion or internal development. A rapid deterioration in England's position, both domestically and internationally. His son Edward II proved to be a weak and ineffective ruler whose reliance on court favorites created the same kinds of political instability that had characterized the reign of Henry III. The military disasters that followed, particularly the devastating defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, essentially reversed all of Edward I's gains in Scotland while damaging English military prestige throughout Europe. The famines and social disruptions of the 1310s further weakened the English state that Edward had worked to strengthen. These immediate problems were followed by even greater catastrophes during the 14th century, including the Black Death plague epidemic that killed approximately 1/3 of England's population. During the 1340s and 1350s, the fact that England survived these disasters and eventually emerged as a major European power under Edward III suggests the fundamental strength of the institutions that Edward I had created. Ultimately, Edward I's reign must be assessed as a period of remarkable achievement that nevertheless fell short of its most ambitious goals. The king succeeded in transforming England from a weak and divided realm into a formidable military power with efficient governmental institutions, but he was unable to complete the unification of the British Isles or establish a secure financial foundation for continued expansion. Modern historians have generally restored Edward's reputation after a period of 19th-century criticism that applied inappropriate moral standards to medieval political behavior. While Edward's methods were often harsh and his policies sometimes brutal, they must be understood within the context of 13th-century political realities rather than later moral sensibilities. The king's achievements in legal reform, administrative efficiency, and military innovation created foundations for England's later emergence as a major European and world power. His parliamentary innovations contributed to the development of representative government, while his legal reforms helped establish the common law tradition that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. Edward I deserves recognition as one of England's most significant medieval monarchs, a ruler who transformed his kingdom and established precedents that would influence British development for centuries. Though he failed to achieve all his ambitions, his reign marked a crucial turning point in English history and laid the groundwork for the achievements of later generations. The legacy of Edward Longshanks thus encompasses both remarkable achievement and troubling failures, reflecting the complexities of medieval kingship and the challenges of building lasting political institutions in an age of personal rule and constant warfare. His story reminds us that even the most capable rulers face limitations, and that historical progress often comes at considerable human cost. As we drift toward sleep, we can reflect on this complex figure who shaped the medieval world through force of will and clarity of purpose. leaving behind institutions and precedents that would outlast his own ambitious but ultimately incomplete vision of unified British rule under the English crown. Edward, later known as King Edward III, and remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs, drew his first breath on November 13, 1312, within the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle in the peaceful countryside of Berkshire. His arrival brought immense joy to a troubled realm, as he secured the royal succession for a dynasty that had been plagued by uncertainty and conflict. His father was Edward II, who had inherited the English crown, the lordship of Ireland, and the duchy of Aquitaine. In France from the formidable Edward I just 5 years earlier. While Edward II had fathered a child around the time of his accession, that son, Adam Fitzroy, had been born outside of marriage and therefore could not inherit the throne. The birth of the future Edward III in 1312 thus provided the legitimate heir that the realm desperately needed. Edward III's mother was Queen Isabella, known to history as the She-Wolf of France, daughter of the powerful French king Philip IV. Born in 1295, Isabella had grown up amid the splendor of the French royal palaces surrounding Paris, before arriving in England in January 1308 as a 12-year-old bride. Just months into what would become her husband's tumultuous 20-year reign, the England into which young Edward was born bore little resemblance to the powerful kingdom his grandfather had forged. Edward I, known as Longshanks, had created one of medieval Europe's most centralized and militarily formidable states during his reign from 1272 to 1307. He had completed the English conquest of Wales, extended English authority across the Irish Sea, and undertaken ambitious campaigns to subjugate Scotland, while simultaneously reforming the judiciary and administration to create the most efficiently governed realm in medieval Europe. However, the magnificent state that Edward Longshanks had constructed presented enormous challenges for his successor. Edward II proved himself fundamentally unsuited to the demands of medieval kingship, placing immense power in the hands of a succession of personal favorites throughout his reign. This practice created deep resentment among England's noble families and political community, who viewed such favoritism as both dangerous and demeaning. The first of these controversial favorites was Piers Gaveston, who had established an intimate relationship with Edward around 1300 when both were still adolescents. Historians continue to debate whether their bond was romantic in nature. But upon Edward's accession in 1307, Gaveston received extraordinary powers and privileges, including elevation to the earldom of Cornwall and numerous lucrative offices. Gaveston's behavior toward the established nobility was arrogant and offensive, leading to his temporary exile to Ireland, where he served as royal deputy. When he returned from exile, his conduct remained unchanged, ultimately resulting in his capture and execution in the summer of 1312 by 2 senior English nobles, the Earls of Lancaster and Warwick, events that occurred just months before the future Edward III's birth. The removal of Gaveston brought no improvement to the political situation. During the 1310s, Edward II began displaying similar favoritism toward Hugh Despencer, the younger son of the Earl of Winchester. As the Despencer family accumulated power and influence, opposition among the English nobility intensified correspondingly. The military situation provided additional cause for concern. Edward I's hard-won gains in Scotland were completely overturned. In 1314, when English forces suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce's Scottish army humiliated a much larger English force, this disaster destroyed English military prestige and eliminated any hope of completing the conquest of Scotland that Edward I had pursued so relentlessly. Environmental catastrophes compounded these political and military disasters. A devastating famine gripped England during the mid-1310s when exceptionally poor weather patterns struck Europe. The year 1314 witnessed nearly 150 days of continuous rainfall, followed by widespread harvest failures that created one of the most severe famines in continental history. Simultaneously, an outbreak of virulent cattle disease decimated livestock populations throughout the realm. These twin disasters killed tens of thousands across England, creating social and economic chaos that further undermined the already weakened monarchy. Despite these dire circumstances surrounding his birth and early childhood, remarkably little is known about young Edward's upbringing and education. Somewhat unusually, he was never formally created Prince of Wales, as had become customary for direct heirs to the English throne since the late 13th century. Instead, he bore the honorary title of Earl of Chester throughout his youth, following royal custom. A separate household independent from that of the king and queen was established for Edward's care and education. This arrangement was considered essential for proper noble training while providing some protection from the political intrigues that constantly surrounded the adult court. Edward was joined by several siblings during his childhood. His brother, John, arrived in August 1316, followed by two sisters, Eleanor and Joan, born in 1318 and 1321, respectively. The growing royal family provided some stability amid the broader chaos affecting the realm. Edward's education may have been partially overseen by Richard Barry, one of 14th century England's most distinguished scholars. However, as was typical for future kings of the medieval period, his training would have emphasized practical skills over academic pursuits. He learned to read and write in both English and French, acquired basic Latin literacy, and possibly gained some familiarity with Flemish and German. Most importantly, for a future medieval monarch, Edward's education centered on horsemanship and military skills. The 14th century remained an age when a king's ability to lead his people in battle was far more important than his knowledge of governmental administration. Evidence from Edward's later career suggests that these physical and martial skills formed the core of his youth development. As Edward approached his 10th year, England's political situation reached a critical breaking point. In 1321, civil war erupted when the king's continued support for the Despencer family finally triggered open rebellion, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the same nobleman who had helped eliminate Piers Gaveston 9 years earlier. Although Edward managed to suppress this revolt the following year and had Lancaster executed near Pontefract Castle in March 1322, the underlying tensions persisted. Hugh Despencer the Younger was now at the height of his power, but he faced a new and formidable enemy in Queen Isabella herself. Isabella had initially tolerated her husband's relationship with Gaveston, despite her obvious displeasure with the situation. However, her antagonism toward Despencer proved far more intense and personal as the 1320s progressed. This conflict increasingly drove the Queen into direct opposition to her, husband's policies and favorite, the crisis that would finally bring Edward II's troubled reign to an end arose from developments in France involving England's continental possessions. Since the Norman conquest of 1066, English kings had held territories in France, initially including the vast Duchy of Normandy, and later expanding to encompass much of southwestern France. By the early 14th century, these holdings had been reduced to the Duchy of Aquitaine, which the English monarchs held not as independent sovereigns but as vassals of the French crown. This feudal relationship created ongoing potential for conflict. Whenever disputes arose between English and French interests. In 1323, a serious incident occurred in Aquitaine when the seneschal of the duchy, Edward II's chief representative there, executed a French royal official. Charles IV of France, who was Isabella's brother, responded by invading the duchy, prompting Hugh Despenser to have Isabella arrested in England as a potentially dangerous French alien. Charles IV then made the diplomatic suggestion that Isabella should be sent to France as Edward's ambassador to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Though highly unusual, this arrangement was accepted by the English king, and Isabella departed for France in March 1325. This decision would prove to be the beginning of the end for Edward II's reign. In France, Isabella encountered Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord, around whom a faction of nobles opposed to Edward II and the Despensers had gathered. The Queen and Mortimer soon entered into both a political alliance and a personal relationship. More significantly, in September 1325, the 12-year-old Edward, Earl of Chester, was dispatched to France to participate in the peace negotiations. Edward II's reasons for sending his heir to continental Europe remain somewhat mysterious, but the most likely explanation involves his reluctance to travel to France personally and pay homage to Charles IV in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. The English king apparently believed he could avoid the diplomatic humiliation of acknowledging his subordinate status to a fellow monarch by transferring the duchy to his son and sending the boy to perform the required homage ceremony. However, this strategy proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. With young Edward now in France, Isabella and Roger Mortimer possessed a viable alternative to Edward II, around whom they could organize a rebellion. When the English government sent commands for the prince's immediate return, Isabella simply refused to comply, making her intentions clear to all observers. By the end of 1325, all the necessary conditions existed for Isabella and Mortimer to attempt the overthrow of Edward II's regime. However, Isabella's brother Charles IV proved reluctant to sponsor a direct invasion of England, forcing the conspirators to seek military support elsewhere. In the summer of 1326, Isabella Mortimer and their supporters, accompanied by the young Prince Edward, traveled to Hainault, a small principality near the modern border between France and Belgium. There, Isabella negotiated an agreement with Count William I, whereby he would provide military assistance in exchange for a marriage alliance between Prince Edward and William's daughter, Philippa. The Count agreed to these terms and provided Isabella and Mortimer with several hundred men. This relatively small force proved sufficient for their purposes when they landed in Suffolk in late September 1326. The invasion's success exceeded even the conspirators' most optimistic expectations. Years of resentment at Edward II's misrule, and the unpopular influence of the Despencer family suddenly erupted throughout England. Most crucially, the City of London declared for Isabella and Prince Edward in mid-November. Edward II was apprehended in South Wales and imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle, while the senior members of the Despencer family were captured and quickly executed. The end of Edward II's reign was then concluded with relative political sophistication rather than continued violence. On January 13, 1327, Parliament formally resolved that Edward II must be deposed in favor of his son. When this resolution was presented to the imprisoned king at Kenilworth, he tearfully agreed to abdicate on January 20th. Prince Edward was accordingly proclaimed as Edward III, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine in London. On January 25th, followed by his formal coronation at Westminster Abbey. A week later, all these momentous actions were undertaken in the name of young Prince Edward, who had just turned 14 in November 1326. There can be no doubt that Edward remained little more than a figurehead at this stage, with real power resting in the hands of his mother Isabella, her lover Roger Mortimer, and their allied supporters. Parliament had initially agreed that the young king would rule in conjunction with a council consisting of 4 bishops, 4 earls, and 6 barons. But this arrangement was quickly marginalized by Isabella and Mortimer, who effectively governed England for the next 3.5 years. Several urgent problems confronted the realm during the early years of Edward III's reign, with the most pressing being the awkward situation of the former king. Edward II's continued existence created obvious difficulties for the new regime, as his potential restoration remained a rallying point for discontented elements throughout the kingdom. In the late spring of 1327, the deposed monarch was transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, but a more permanent solution was clearly needed. Isabella and Mortimer's regime was already generating opposition, particularly due to resentment at the extraordinary power Mortimer now exercised, and this discontent was beginning to coalesce around the idea of liberating and reinstating the former king. The matter was resolved definitively on September 21, 1327, when Edward II was discreetly murdered at Berkeley Castle on Isabella and Mortimer's orders. The removal of this potential threat stabilized the new regime's position, but also demonstrated the ruthless methods the new rulers were prepared to employ. An even more serious challenge emerged from Scotland, where Robert the Bruce recognized the instability created by Edward II's overthrow as an excellent opportunity to further weaken English power. Throughout 1327, Scottish forces launched a series of devastating raids into northern England and English possessions in Ireland. During the summer of 1327, young King Edward III undertook his first military campaign, leading an expedition northward. That became known as the Weardale Campaign after the river, where much of the action occurred in July and August. James Douglas, in alliance with the Earls of Mar and Moray, led a Scottish force of perhaps 10,000 men southward into northern England. Isabella and Mortimer viewed a successful campaign against the traditional Scottish enemy as an excellent means of legitimizing their hold on power in Edward's name. So they departed York in mid-July with their own forces to engage the invaders. Weeks of complex maneuvering followed as both armies attempted to locate each other and gain tactical advantage before a tense standoff developed near the river, where that lasted 3 days. Finally, On the night of August 3rd, and into the early hours of August 4th, the Scottish forces launched a surprise attack that penetrated to the very center of the English royal encampment. In this critical moment, young Edward came extraordinarily close to being captured by Douglas's troops. Although the ropes of the royal tent were actually cut, the young monarch escaped unharmed and uncaptured. But the experience left a profound impression on him. The Scottish attack was ultimately repelled, but the Weardale campaign proved inconclusive overall. In early 1328, the regime was forced to stabilize the northern frontier by agreeing to the Treaty of Northampton, whereby Edward renounced English claims to overlordship of Scotland and acknowledged Robert the Bruce as Scotland's rightful king. The military disappointments were compounded by a diplomatic crisis that erupted in February 1328 with far-reaching consequences. On the first day of that month, Charles IV of France died, leaving only daughters as his direct heirs. Since French law prohibited female succession to the throne, this brought the direct line of Capetian kings to an end. After ruling France since the late 10th century, only two serious candidates existed to succeed. Charles IV, Edward III of England, possessed the strongest claim as a grandson of Philip IV through his mother, Isabella. However, this claim received little consideration in France, where the prospect of foreign rule was considered intolerable by the French nobility. The alternative candidate was Philip of Valois, a direct descendant of Philip III of France, who had ruled from 1270 to 1285. Despite his weaker genealogical claim, Philip was formally proclaimed as King of France on April 1, 1328, and crowned at Rheims Cathedral as Philip VI. On May 29, it is crucial to understand that Edward did possess the superior claim to the French throne through his mother's lineage. Moreover, as a king himself, he regarded Philip as a social inferior who was merely a count. This sense of divine right and legitimate claim would later instill in Edward a tremendous determination to emerge victorious from the conflicts that would follow. In the immediate aftermath of Philip's coronation, a delegation sent by Isabella and Mortimer arrived in Paris to protest Edward's exclusion from the succession. Despite their protests, the French remained adamant in their position. Eventually, after months of futile objections, 16-year-old Edward traveled to France in the spring of 1329 and performed homage to Philip VI at Amiens Cathedral in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. Superficially, this ceremony appeared to resolve the succession dispute, but it would prove to be merely the prelude to a conflict that would last for over a century and fundamentally reshape both England and France. While these international storms were brewing, Edward was gradually developing his own independence and political sophistication. In November 1327, he had been married by proxy to Philippa of Hainault, fulfilling the agreement Isabella had made with Count William in exchange for his military support in overthrowing Edward II. However, while Edward had been willing to follow his mother's lead on this and many other matters in 1327 and 1328, by 1329 he was becoming increasingly assertive and less willing to allow the realm to be governed by Isabella and Mortimer without his active participation. That year, secret communications were sent to the papal court at Avignon by allies of the young king, alerting the Pope that Edward was not able to rule in his own right and requesting intervention. These messages demonstrated growing opposition to the Regency regime and Edward's increasing desire to assume personal control of his kingdom. The crisis came to a head in 1330, when enemies of Mortimer began spreading rumors that Edward II was still alive, and plotting began for a potential uprising in the former king's name. However, what really spurred Edward to action were rumors that Isabella was pregnant with Mortimer's child. Concerns were raised by Edward's advisors, notably his close confidant William Montague, that Isabella and Mortimer might be planning to usurp the throne entirely. In this scenario, Mortimer would divorce his wife of nearly 30 years and marry Isabella, with the pair then placing their own child on the throne in Edward's place. After a confrontation at Nottingham Castle in mid-October 1330, Edward decided to act decisively. On the night of October 19th, the young king, still several weeks shy of his 18th birthday, along with Montague and approximately a dozen companions, burst into Isabella and Mortimer's apartments at Nottingham Castle. A violent struggle ensued, in which several attendants were killed before Edward succeeded in having his mother and her lover arrested. In the days that followed, a parliament was summoned, and an announcement made to the political nation that henceforth Edward would rule in his own right. Mortimer was dispatched to London, where he was accused and convicted without trial of various high crimes and treasonous acts. On November 29, 1330, he became the first individual ever executed at Tyburn, a site that would become infamous for political executions in the centuries that followed. Edward showed mercy to his mother by sparing her life, but her political career was definitively ended. In the aftermath of Mortimer's execution, Isabella was confined to Windsor Castle, where she reportedly suffered a partial nervous breakdown. She remained under house arrest until 1332, before being permitted to retire to Castle Rising in Norfolk. At Castle Rising, Isabella lived an expensive but largely sedentary existence for the next quarter century. Her family maintained contact with her, and there were occasional discussions about her traveling to France. But Edward evidently refused to allow this, demonstrating his continued resentment toward a mother who had favored Mortimer over her own son. Isabella became increasingly pious in her later years, ultimately becoming a nun of the Order of St. Clare shortly before her death on August 22, 1358. Her tragic end reflected the personal costs of the political upheavals that had characterized Edward's youth. With Isabella and Mortimer removed from power, Edward III was finally free to begin ruling in his own right from late 1330 onward, just as he reached his 18th birthday. The years ahead would witness remarkable achievements as England recovered from a quarter century of turmoil and weakness to ascend to unprecedented heights of medieval power. Under Edward's personal leadership, England would rise to a position of dominance unparalleled at any other time during the medieval period. This expansion of English power began in Scotland, where the aftermath of the Treaty of Northampton had created new opportunities for English intervention. The treaty agreed between Robert the Bruce and Isabella's regime in early 1328 had included provisions for recognizing the territorial claims of several English border lords to lands in southern Scotland, particularly Henry Percy and Henry Beaumont. However, little actual progress was made in transferring ownership of these territories to the English claimants. This situation remained unresolved following Robert's death in 1329 and the accession of his young son David II, who was still a minor, requiring a regency government. The lack of progress in implementing the territorial provisions of the treaty provided the affected English lords with grounds for complaint and potential action. These disinherited lords, as they became known, began conspiring during the early 1330s to overthrow the Bruce dynasty in Scotland by reviving the alternative. Balliol claimed to the Scottish throne that Edward I had championed decades earlier. Edward Balliol, the rival claimant, was brought from France by Henry Beaumont and his ally. The disinherited lords petitioned Edward III for permission to invade Scotland, which was officially refused, though perhaps with sufficient implicit encouragement that they decided to proceed independently of royal authorization. In the summer of 1332, these lords launched a naval expedition from Yorkshire that landed at Kinghorn in Fife, on Scotland's eastern coast. Advancing inland, they achieved a crushing victory over Scottish forces at the Battle of Duplin Moor on August 11, 1332, though casualty figures remain imprecise. Perhaps as many as 5,000 Scots perished, while the invading force suffered minimal losses. 6 weeks later, Edward Balliol was crowned as King of Scotland at Scone, initiating what historians call the Second Scottish War of Independence. This conflict would continue for the next quarter-century and provide Edward III with his first opportunities to demonstrate the military genius that would define his reign. Initially, Edward had not directly supported the disinherited lords' invasion, maintaining official neutrality while presumably hoping for their success. However, a parliament convened at Westminster in September 1532 quickly suggested that the Treaty of Northampton should be abandoned and Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne acknowledged to secure Edward's support. Balliol indicated his willingness to acknowledge Scotland as a vassal state of the English crown and to pay homage to Edward III as his overlord. These offers represented exactly the kind of arrangement that Edward's grandfather had tried, unsuccessfully, to impose on Scotland. Initially reluctant to commit to a potentially lengthy Scottish war, Edward's position changed when Balliol was driven into northern England following his defeat at the Battle of Annan in December 1332. This development forced Edward to choose between abandoning Balliol entirely or providing him with the full support necessary to regain his throne. Edward chose to support Balliol decisively, demonstrating the single-minded determination that would characterize his approach to all major undertakings. The English Parliament and government offices, including the Exchequer and law courts, were relocated to York, where they would remain for several years while Edward focused on re-establishing English control over Scotland. The first objective was capturing the border town of Berwick, which was then part of Scotland. Balliol initiated a siege in March 1333 with Edward's backing, and the king arrived personally to oversee the campaign during the early summer. The garrison and townspeople eventually informed the Peekaboo Cutterment that they would surrender if military relief did not arrive by mid-July. This ultimatum created the circumstances that would lead to Edward III's first great military victory. Sir Archibald Douglas, serving as guardian of Scotland during David II's minority, assembled a substantial army of over 20,000 men and advanced southward to engage Edward's forces. The armies clashed on July 19, 1333, at Halidon Hill, approximately 2 kilometers northwest of Berwick. Edward III entered the Battle of Halidon Hill heavily outnumbered, commanding less than 10,000 men against Douglas's force of approximately 20,000. Edward compensated for his numerical disadvantage through superior strategic positioning and innovative military tactics. The English king had deliberately occupied Halidon Hill because it dominated the surrounding terrain, and he resisted all temptations to abandon this advantageous position, even when Douglas conducted raids further south into northern England in the days preceding the battle. Edward's forces also possessed superior military technology that would benefit him not only at Halidon Hill but in many future engagements. Most important was the 6-foot longbow, which could deploy volleys of iron-tipped arrows that penetrated mail armor with devastating effectiveness. This weapon was far superior to the slow, cumbersome crossbows that formed the backbone of most European armies in the early 14th century. The widespread adoption of the longbow was just one component of the military revolution that Edward III would implement during his reign. The Battle of Halidon Hill commenced around midday on July 19th. Although numerically superior, the Scottish forces were required to advance uphill against Edward's entrenched position. Douglas should have avoided attacking Edward while the English maintained the high ground, but the imminent expiration of Berwick's ultimatum left him little choice but to attempt relieving the town. The result was a complete rout of the Scottish forces. English longbowmen decimated the advancing Scottish armies as they struggled up the hillside, while Edward's cavalry waited for the optimal moment to launch their own devastating charge down the slope. By the end of the day, thousands of Scottish troops lay dead, perhaps as many as half of Douglas's entire army of 20,000 men. Douglas himself and 5 Scottish earls were among the casualties, while English losses were minimal in comparison. Halidon Hill established Edward's reputation as one of Europe's most formidable military commanders and marked the beginning of English military ascendancy after decades of defeat and humiliation. The victory also placed Edward in an extremely advantageous political position regarding Scotland. Berwick surrendered immediately after the battle, and numerous Scottish men paid homage to the English king in the following days and weeks. Balliol was restored to the Scottish throne and agreed in February 1334 to surrender 8 counties comprising the entirety of southern Scotland below the Firth of Forth and Solway Firth. In June 1334, Balliol formally paid homage to Edward as his liege lord at Newcastle, completing what appeared to be a comprehensive English victory that had brought Scotland under English control more thoroughly than at any time since Edward I's early campaigns. David, too, and his supporters fled to France, seemingly ending Scottish resistance and fulfilling Edward's goal of establishing English hegemony over the northern kingdom. However, this apparent success would prove as temporary as many of Edward I's earlier victories in Scotland, where Edward III succeeded brilliantly in military campaigns. His ally Balliol consistently failed in the political arena. No sooner had Edward reinstated him on the Scottish throne than Balliol managed to provoke another revolt during the summer of 1334, forcing him to flee Scotland yet again. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the 1330s, with Edward repeatedly intervening to restore Balliol, while the Scots continued to reject his authority. Despite annual English campaigns into Scotland and even ventures into the Highlands, the Scottish resistance proved impossible to eliminate entirely. By 1337, Scotland remained incompletely pacified, and the war showed signs of continuing indefinitely. Nevertheless, Edward's policies toward Scotland during the 1330s must be considered largely successful, as they restored English influence in the north, two levels not seen for 30 years. Most significantly, Edward captured Berwick, which would remain an English stronghold on the Scottish border for centuries thereafter, except for a brief period during the 15th century. The English king might have achieved even greater success in Scotland had his attention not been drawn elsewhere by developments that would have far more momentous consequences. The distraction that would redirect Edward's attention from Scotland came from France, and would ultimately lead to consequences that would reverberate for over a century. The causes of what historians call the 100 Years' War lay in the earlier death of Charles IV in 1328, and the disputed succession that had brought Philip of Valois to the French throne. As we have seen, Edward possessed a superior claim to the French crown through his mother, Isabella, but the French nobility had elected to support Philip's accession rather than accept an English king. Isabella and Mortimer had reluctantly accepted this situation, sending Edward to pay homage to Philip in 1329. But the matter was far from permanently resolved. The ongoing war in Scotland provided the catalyst for renewed conflict over the French succession. Scotland and France maintained their traditional ALD alliance, formed out of mutual antagonism toward England. It was therefore natural for David II and his advisers to seek refuge in France following Edward's victory at Halidon Hill. Over the following years, Philip VI provided substantial support for David's cause, culminating in 1336 with plans for a massive French invasion of Scotland. Edward prevented this by devastating Scotland's coastal regions, burning crops and seizing livestock, so that no French army could find sufficient supplies to sustain itself after landing. Other controversies contributed to deteriorating Anglo-French relations, notably Edward's provision of sanctuary to Robert, Count of Artois, who was Philip VI's cousin and mortal enemy. However, the immediate cause of war was much simpler and more direct. Edward's most vulnerable possessions lay in France itself. On May 24, 1337, Philip VI formally announced that he was confiscating the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. Late that summer, the Count of Eu invaded Gascony with a French army, devastating the countryside, although failing to capture the duchy's principal city of Bordeaux. This invasion constituted the first military action of a war that would continue for over a century. Once hostilities commenced, Edward faced immediate tactical challenges in defending his continental possessions while simultaneously pursuing his broader objectives. Aquitaine's location in southwestern France made it relatively difficult to supply from England, leading Edward to adopt the strategy he would employ throughout the conflict, attacking Philip VI's possessions directly across the English Channel in northern France, while using territorial gains there to pressure the French into abandoning their assault on Aquitaine. This approach had its own limitations, particularly regarding the logistics of transporting sufficient forces to northern France. Medieval ships were small, and moving an army large enough to achieve strategic objectives would prove highly challenging. Edward's solution mirrored a strategy his grandfather had employed in the 1290s, seeking alliances among the numerous princes and rulers of the Low Countries and Germany. In the summer of 1337, Edward dispatched Bishop Henry Burghersh of Lincoln and his ally William Montague, recently ennobled as Earl of Salisbury, to negotiate these agreements. Alliances were quickly secured with Hainault, Gelders, and Brabant in the Low Countries, and most significantly with Louis, Duke of Bavaria, who was the reigning Holy Roman Emperor. These rulers committed to providing approximately 7,000 troops to support Edward's French campaign, in addition to shipping and logistical assistance. Combined with the 10,000 men Edward intended to bring from England, this would create a formidable force of nearly 20,000 troops for operations in northern France. However, these alliances came at enormous cost, with the continental princes receiving promises of financial subsidies from England totaling £124,000 by the end of 1337. This sum represented several times Edward's annual income, forcing him to borrow heavily from Italian merchant banking families, while simultaneously introducing new taxes in England and requesting extensive subsidies from Parliament. The latter development proved significant for English constitutional development. Edward's use of Parliament to obtain financing for his French wars facilitated the gradual development of England's parliamentary system. It was always understood that parliaments were called when monarchs needed funding from the political nation, while the political community could express grievances and requests in return. Edward set sail from England on July 16, 1338, landing near Antwerp with nearly 10 men. A meeting followed on September 5 at Koblenz on the Rhine between Edward and Louis of Bavaria, at which the Holy Roman Emperor appointed Edward as Vicar General of the Empire, theoretically placing the military resources of the entire empire at his disposal. With his armies assembled and his continental alliances secured, Edward was finally positioned to launch active military operations in northern France. During the spring of 1339, however, this first campaign brought considerable frustration as Philip VI refused to engage in direct combat, avoiding the decisive battle that Edward sought. Perhaps due to these frustrations, Edward made the momentous decision in early 1342 resurrect his claim to the French throne. Until this point, his stated objective had been defending his possessions in Aquitaine, but this changed dramatically in January 1340. The decision may have been influenced by Jacob van Artevelde, a native of Ghent who had become the dominant political figure in Flanders. Van Artevelde threw Flemish support behind Edward and persuaded him to formally assert his claims to the French throne. On January 26, 1340, Edward began using the title and arms of the kings of France, a decision that would have profound and lasting consequences. English monarchs would continue claiming the French throne until 1802, while the immediate effect was to provide England with justification for continental involvement that would allow the English state to maintain a foothold in France until the mid-16th century. Having claimed the French throne at the beginning of 1340, Edward shifted his focus to the naval conflict in the English Channel. Philip VI had been building an impressive fleet during the early stages of the war, which, combined with ships provided by his Castilian allies, numbered just over 200 vessels. By the summer of 340, the English fleet was rapidly expanded to approximately 150 ships by the time of the decisive engagement. Though numerically inferior, the English fleet possessed advantages that would prove crucial in the coming battle. The decisive naval engagement occurred at Sluys, off the coast of Flanders, on Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1340. Here, the smaller English fleet managed to engage the French ships at close quarters, allowing Edward Pell to employ the same longbow tactics that had proven so effective at Halidon Hill. English archers used their superior weapons to devastating effect throughout the day. By evening, approximately 18,000 French mariners and soldiers had lost their lives, while all but 23 of over 200 French ships had been destroyed or captured. All French senior naval commanders perished in the engagement. Edward demonstrated at Sluys that he was capable of winning substantial victories at sea as well as on land. He had personally participated in the fighting and was wounded by an arrow in the thigh. Naval attacks throughout the mid-14th century. However, Edward now faced a challenge that could not be defeated in battle: the enormous cost of the war. In November 1340, several months after Sluys, Edward returned secretly to England to confront his government about financial issues. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, initially resisted Edward's demands, but a reconciliation was eventually achieved in 1341 as events in Scotland again demanded the king's attention. While war had raged in France during the late 1330s and early 1340s, the Scottish conflict had necessarily become a lower priority for Edward. However, David II had returned to Scotland from France in the summer of 1341, quickly seizing Edinburgh and Stirling for the Bruce cause. These developments required Edward's immediate attention, and he campaigned extensively on the Anglo-Scottish border throughout the winter of 1341 to 1342. However, before he could achieve decisive results in Scotland, renewed conflict in France became the ultimate priority once again. In April 1341, John III, Duke of Brittany, died without a clear heir, creating a succession dispute that presented Edward with an opportunity to test whether his claim to the French crown carried any weight within France itself. Edward supported the claim of John de Montfort, while Philip VI backed Charles, Count of Blois. This began the War of the Breton Succession, a major component of the broader Hundred Years' War that would continue for the next quarter century. The Breton conflict provided Edward with an excellent opportunity to continue challenging Philip's authority in France, which he exploited expertly in the years ahead. The War of the Breton Succession continued into the mid-1340s, and it was this localized conflict that provided the pretext for Edward to begin preparing a major new invasion force in England during 1345. The expedition finally departed for France the following year, but when it did, the campaign of 1346 would produce some of the most significant engagements of the entire Hundred Years' War, and several of Edward's most celebrated military victory. The exact objectives of the 1346 expedition to France were kept largely secret during its preparation, and it remains unclear whether Edward had a specific strategic plan from the beginning or developed his approach in response to events as they unfolded. What we know is what actually occurred. Edward's army, consisting of between 12,000 and 15,000 men, landed on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy on July 12, 1346. His goal was to conduct an extensive chevauchée, or military raid, across French territory, strategic approach that became central to Edward's military revolution. The campaign achieved remarkable success in the weeks that followed. The first major strategic victory came on July 26, when the town of Caen in Normandy was captured by Edward's forces. A devastating sack of the city lasted 5 days before Edward's army advanced eastward, with the route to Paris now lying open. As substantial as the capture of Caen had been, the main military achievement of Edward's 1346 campaign occurred a month later. As the English king advanced toward Paris, Philip VI frantically gathered his forces to protect the French capital, assembling an army of well over 20,000 men by mid-August. Meanwhile, Edward had skirted Paris and turned northward toward Flanders, hoping to combine with allies from the Low Countries. When the two monarchs finally met in battle on August 26, 1346, it was far north of Paris, near Calais, just outside the town of Crécy and Poitiers, the Battle of Crécy. On August 26, 1346, would prove to be one of the most consequential engagements of the entire 100 Years' War, and a defining moment in medieval military history. When Edward learned that Philip's army was approaching, he positioned his forces on the high ground along the right bank of the River May as it flowed past the village of Crécy. The tactical use of elevated terrain had served Edward well at Halidon Hill, and it would prove equally effective here. Edward organized his forces into 3 divisions, a central unit of dismounted men-at-arms that he commanded personally, flanked on either side by formations of longbowmen. This arrangement would become the standard English battle formation for decades to come. The French attack came late in the afternoon and proved catastrophic for Philip's forces. The crossbows, favored by French armies, proved completely inferior to English longbows, and a division of French crossbowmen quickly broke under sustained English archery. Philip then attempted to send his cavalry directly up the hill toward Edward's center, but like the Scots at Halidon Hill, the French cavalry was devastated by concentrated longbow fire as they struggled to reach the English positions. When the cavalry charge finally reached Edward's dismounted men-at-arms, the horsemen were already severely weakened by arrow wounds and exhausted from their uphill assault. The resulting close-quarters combat was brutally one-sided by dawn on August 27th, when the French finally abandoned the field. Approximately 4,000 French troops had been killed, while English losses numbered only a few hundred. The Battle of Crécy definitively established the superiority of English longbow tactics over continental military method. The victory also solidified Edward's reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders, having comprehensively defeated the French king despite being outnumbered by nearly 2 to 1. Significantly, Crécy was also notable for the first recorded use of artillery in a Western European field battle. As Edward's forces employed a small number of early cannon, the immediate consequence of Edward's stunning victory was that northern France lay largely undefended. Edward turned his forces toward the nearby port of Calais and began a siege on September 3rd that would last nearly a full year. The siege of Calais would ultimately stand as one of Edward's greatest accomplishments. The port finally fell on August 3rd, 1347, and would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries until the French finally recaptured it in 1558. The victories at Crécy and Calais were not Edward's only major successes during this period. While the king campaigned in France, conflict continued on England's northern border. where David II attempted to take advantage of Edward's absence by invading northern England. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. On October 17, 1346, David II's forces, numbering approximately 12,000 men, met an English army of just over 6,000 at Neville's Cross near Durham. Despite their numerical advantage, the Scots were comprehensively routed, with perhaps 2,000 Scottish troops killed and, most significantly, David II himself captured. By the autumn of 1347. Edward's fortunes had reached unprecedented heights. In France, he had won a stunning victory over Philip at Crécy and followed it up by capturing Calais. In Scotland, the rival claimant to the throne had been captured, leaving Edward in an extremely powerful negotiating position. To consolidate his position, Edward negotiated a 9-month truce in October 1347 and returned to England victorious. It was during this zenith of achievement that Edward chose to implement an idea he had been developing since at least 1344. Inspired by Arthurian legend and the ideal of the Round Table, Edward had long harbored plans to establish his own chivalric order. In 1344, he had even begun construction work on a headquarters for such an order at Windsor Castle. With his military fortunes prospering in both France and Scotland, Edward elected to create this knightly brotherhood dedicated to St. George, named for the sword belt that its members would wear. This became the Order of the Garter, which remains the most senior order of knighthood in the British honors system to this day. The order's emblem is a garter bearing the motto Honi soit, qui mal, why pence, which translates from Middle French as shame on him who thinks evil of it. Legend claims this phrase was uttered by Edward when the Countess of Salisbury's garter slipped while dancing, and the king rebuked courtiers who laughed at the incident. However, this romantic story appears to be later invention, as no written account exists until the 1460s, over a century after the order's foundation. The true origins of the motto remain mysterious, adding to the order's mystique at its foundation. The Order of the Garter consisted of Edward himself and 25 knights. Many of the founding members are unsurprising. Edward's eldest son, known as the Black Prince, was among the first knights, as were Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and several of the most senior nobles who had supported Edward's military campaigns. More surprisingly, the founding members included Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of Marchgrand, son of the very man who had usurped royal authority in the late 1320s and was executed in 1330. This younger Mortimer had been rehabilitated during the early 1340s, partly through his friendship with the Black Prince. Many of the other founding knights had accompanied Edward during his victorious 1346 campaign in France, and it seems clear that the order was created partly to commemorate the great victories at Crécy and Calais. Alongside establishing the Order of the Garter, Edward undertook a massive reconstruction of Windsor Castle. Conscious of the propaganda value of an imposing royal residence, Edward oversaw the most significant expansion of this primary royal residence during the medieval period. The project eventually cost £50,000, making it the most expensive building project undertaken by any English monarch during the medieval period. The scale of this investment demonstrated both Edward's wealth and his understanding of the importance of royal magnificence in maintaining prestige and authority. However, just as Edward's reign was reaching its peak, catastrophe struck in the form of a pandemic that would devastate Europe. The bubonic plague, known to history as the Black Death, arrived in Europe in 1347. Carried from the Black Sea region by fleas living on black rats aboard Genoese merchant ships, the disease caused horrific suffering and death. During the first week of infection, victims developed flu-like symptoms, including fever, headache, and vomiting. Then lymph nodes began swelling to form buboes on the neck, armpits, and groin. These eventually burst open. Gangrene developed in the extremity, and death typically occurred due to organ failure. Estimates suggest that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed approximately 30 million people in Europe, roughly one of the continent's population. The plague reached England in the late summer of 1348, with the first recorded cases in London occurring in October. Edward was acutely aware of the plague's deadly potential, as his 14-year-old daughter Joan had succumbed to the disease in Bordeaux just as it first appeared in England. Like many later English monarchs, Edward left London and spent the following months in less densely populated areas where the disease circulated less aggressively. The Black Death caused enormous difficulties beyond the immediate mortality and suffering. The social and economic disruption was equally severe, with Parliament sessions abandoned, courts adjourned for months, and mass graves dug throughout the kingdom. However, the most pressing long-term issue was labor shortage, with the population drastically reduced. Lack of manpower threatened to cripple the European economy for decades. Edward's response to this crisis represented one of his most significant but underappreciated achievements. In the summer of 1349, a preliminary ordinance regulating labor was issued, followed in 1351 by the Comprehensive Statute of Laborers. Through this legislation, the labor market was regulated by fixing wages at pre-plague levels, ensuring that the English economy could continue functioning despite the severe labor shortage. Although it may lack the drama of Edward's military victories, the Statute of Laborers was crucial to England's survival and recovery. England became the only European country to implement effective labor controls during the 1350s, allowing it to maintain economic stability while other kingdoms struggled with the pandemic's aftermath. The enforcement of the statute was entrusted to justices of the peace, judicial officers who enforced laws at the county level. These officials had existed previously, but the 1350s saw them gain greater authority and significance as local representatives of royal power. Through this system, Edward not only stabilized the labor market, but also strengthened local government structures that would remain important for centuries. The office of Justice of the Peace was later exported to many other countries between the Crécy 16th and 19th centuries. Edward also implemented a major reform of English coinage in 1351, introducing gold coins and a new silver coin called the groat. These monetary reforms helped stabilize the economy during the post-plague recovery period. While Edward was not personally an administrator with expertise in governmental minutiae, his great strength lay in selecting capable officials and delegating authority effectively. Figures like John Thoresby and William Sherlow oversaw the implementation of these crucial domestic reforms. The death of Philip VI on August 22, 1350, encouraged Edward to begin aggressively pursuing his French claims against Philip's son, Jean II. However, a renewed French alliance with Castile and the presence of a Castilian fleet in the English Channel limited Edward's immediate options. 4 major campaigns. When large-scale operations finally resumed in 1355, Edward planned a two-pronged invasion, one directly across the Channel to northern France, and a subsidiary campaign in Gascony. The latter campaign would feature 9 of whom survived infancy, a remarkably high survival rate for the medieval period. Of these 9, 5 were sons and 4 were daughters. Edward's heir was his eldest son, also named Edward but known to history as the Black Prince. Born in 1330, he had already demonstrated his military potential by commanding a division at Crécy when just 16 years old and serving as a founding member of the Order of the Garter. It was the Black Prince who commanded the 1355 campaign. In Aquitaine, traveling with approximately 300 ships and several thousand men to Bordeaux in mid-September. The military campaigning season was nearly over, but Edward Jr. conducted a brief expedition toward Toulouse before retiring to Bordeaux for the winter. While the 1355 campaigns proved relatively modest, the following year would witness one of the most significant engagements of the entire 100 Years' War. The Black Prince's great chevauchée of Isen-Wulil began in July, with a force of approximately 6,000 men proceeding eastward through central France. The Black Prince's forces burned several towns, including Bourges, before turning back toward Bordeaux in late August. During this movement, King Jean II elected to engage the English army with a force numbering over 10,000 men. Jean may have believed that the Black Prince was an inferior commander compared to his father, and he certainly possessed a substantial numerical advantage. However, if the French king expected these factors to ensure victory, he was catastrophically mistaken. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, would prove to be one of the Black Prince's greatest triumphs and one of the most decisive engagements of the medieval period. The Black Prince's forces were heavily outnumbered by the French army, but they employed the same tactical innovations that had proven so effective at Crécy. A feigned retreat first threw the French lines into confusion, while English longbowmen again demonstrated their devastating effectiveness against continental military formations. Perhaps 2,500 French troops were killed by the end of the battle. But the most significant result was the capture of Jean II himself, with David II of Scotland already in English custody since Neville's Cross 10 years earlier. Edward III now held both the French and Scottish kings as his prisoners. This unprecedented situation placed Edward in an extraordinarily advantageous negotiating position. He eventually chose to ransom both captive monarchs in exchange for substantial military, territorial, and political concessions that would reshape the balance of power in Western Europe. The Treaty of Berwick, concluded on October 3, 1357, secured David II's release after 11 years in captivity. Edward Balliol had relinquished his claim to the Scottish throne in 1356, allowing Edward III to press his own claim if he had chosen to do so. Instead, Edward opted for a more pragmatic approach. David II was released in return for a ransom of 100,000 marks, approximately £67,000. While the arrangement effectively ended the long Second Scottish War of Independence after a quarter-century of conflict, most importantly, the treaty represented Edward's final acceptance of Bruce's sovereignty over Scotland, bringing the prolonged conflict to a conclusion that allowed both kingdoms to focus their energies elsewhere. Negotiating. Jean II's release proved more complex and time-consuming. In the interim, the French king was held at various locations in England, including the Tower of London. While preliminary discussions took place in 1358, a draft agreement worked out in London would have acknowledged Edward's possession of Calais and granted him the neighboring county of Ponthieu, while substantially expanding the Duchy of Aquitaine to include much of western France. A substantial ransom would also have been paid for Jean's release. However, this preliminary agreement could not be finalized, leading Edward to resume military operations in 1359. He expanded his demands to include former English possessions in Normandy, as well as control over Maine and Anjou, and overlordship of Brittany. In return, Edward promised to renounce his claims to the French throne, but the territorial concessions he now sought would have involved England taking direct control of almost half of France. The French, naturally, could not accept such terms, even with their king in captivity. Active campaigning recommenced. In autumn 1359, when Edward led an army of over 10,000 men from Calais on a destructive march through eastern and central France. Though he threatened both Reims and Paris, Edward was unable to achieve the decisive victory that would have improved his negotiating position by the late 1350s. The French had learned to avoid direct confrontation with English armies, having suffered multiple defeats when engaging Edward's forces in conventional battles. This strategic adjustment created a military stalemate that could only be resolved through diplomacy. Negotiations recommenced in early 1360, resulting in the Treaty of Bretigny, named after the town near Chartres where it was concluded. Edward ratified the treaty on October 24, 1360, marking what many historians consider the peak of English power during the medieval period. Under the treaty's terms, Jean II would be released in return for an enormous ransom of £500,000. Edward agreed to renounce his claims to the French throne, while in return receiving territorial concessions that Jean had initially agreed to in London in 1358. Edward gained Calais and the county of Ponthieu in northern France, plus a substantially enlarged Duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest. These territorial acquisitions were greater than England would control at any other point during the 100 Years' War. Some provisions of the Treaty of Bretigny would never be fully implemented, as both Edward and Jean proved reluctant to completely abandon certain claims. Nevertheless, the treaty was agreed upon and would remain in effect for nearly a decade. The treaty represented a major victory for England and marked arguably the peak of Edward's reign. England's territorial possessions in France were at their greatest extent. The Scottish border had been secured through the arrangement with David II, and English military prestige stood at unprecedented heights. The Treaty of Bretigny inaugurated the first period of sustained peace during Edward III's long reign. The 1360s proved comparatively tranquil, allowing England to enjoy the fruits of its military successes while implementing important domestic reforms. In 1362, with Parliament's consent, Edward reformed the wool staple, the mechanism for exporting wool from England. The goal was establishing a new staple at Calais, channeling wool exports through a single continental port. This initiative had considerable significance, as English wool was arguably the country's greatest export commodity for the next 3 centuries. The wool trade was largely sold through markets in northern France and the Low Countries. Edward was positioning England to capitalize on future market developments while maintaining control over this crucial economic sector. The most substantial domestic reform of the 1360s concerned the English language itself. Since the Norman conquest of 1066, French had served as the language of government and law courts, even though a hybrid Middle English had become the common tongue of the English people. Edward attempted to change this situation fundamentally. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading ordered that English should be used in law courts rather than French. Similarly, when Parliament met in 1363, the opening ceremonies were conducted in English for the first time. These language reforms represented important advances in the formal adoption of English as the language of government, contributing to the development of a more unified English national identity. The 1360s also witnessed important developments in Ireland under the leadership of Edward's second surviving son, Lionel of Clarence. Because of the focus on France and Scotland during most of his reign, Edward had been unable to devote much personal attention to Ireland. A parliament held at Kilkenny in 1366 promulgated a series of statutes designed to separate the English from the Irish population and protect English areas from Irish cultural influence. The Statutes of Kilkenny prohibited intermarriage between English and Irish communities and prevented the English from adopting Irish customs and practices. These measures substantially arrested the potential decline of English power in Ireland during the mid-14th century and formed a major foundation for English lordship in Ireland through the early 16th century. While the 1360s represented a relatively peaceful period, the last decade of Edward's reign would bring fresh challenges. However, Edward was no longer the central figure in governance during his final 7 or 8 years. References to Edward's declining health first appear in 1369, when he was 57 years old. He would live for another 8 years, but clear indications suggest the king suffered increasingly from both physical and mental afflictions as the 1370s progressed. The most serious of these ailments appear to have been caused by a series of strokes during his final years. These health problems certainly limited Edward's role in governance. Administration increasingly devolved to his sons and extended family. The resumption of war in France occurred while Edward's health was deteriorating. Peace had lasted for nearly a decade since the Treaty of Bretigny, but this stability became increasingly tenuous as French power recovered. Charles V had succeeded his father Jean II as King of France in May 1364. The new monarch proved more aggressive than his predecessor, working systematically to restore French strength after the defeats of the 1340s and 1350s. Charles exploited internal unrest within Aquitaine in 1369 to demand that the Black Prince appear before him as his feudal superior. When the heir to the English throne refused, Charles declared the duchy forfeit, instantly reigniting the 100 Years' War. Edward responded in summer 1369 by resuming his claim to the French throne, which he had agreed to surrender in 1360. The war was thus rejoined just as Edward's health problems were becoming serious. This new phase of the conflict differed fundamentally from the campaigns of the 1340s and 1350s. Edward would never again lead an invasion of France personally, with military operations largely conducted by his sons. The complexity of these multiple conflicts perhaps reflected the fact that Edward was no longer providing the dynamic leadership that had characterized his earlier victories. Much of Aquitaine was overrun during the early 1370s. The Castilians, allied with France, defeated the English at sea off La Rochelle in June 1372. This naval defeat severely limited England's ability to resupply its continental territories. A major campaign was undertaken in 1373 in an attempt to reverse these setbacks. John of Gaunt led a great chevauchée from Calais through eastern France to Bordeaux, leaving considerable destruction in its wake, but failing in its main objective of reimposing English authority in Brittany by the mid-1370s. Without Edward's personal leadership, the English position in France had deteriorated significantly. English control was largely confined to Calais in the north and coastal regions of Gascony, including Bordeaux. Pope Gregory XI offered to broker peace between the belligerents in 1374, resulting in the Treaty of Bruges, agreed on June 27, 1375. This allowed England time to regroup, but was unpopular domestically because it acknowledged the weakened English position in northern France. The treaty would not last long, as the fundamental issue of Aquitaine's sovereignty remained unresolved. The English wanted the duchy freed entirely from French overlordship, while Charles V understandably refused to abandon all claims to this valuable territory. War resumed in 1377, but by then it would be the responsibility of Edward's successor to manage the conflict. While the final years of Edward's reign saw military setbacks in France, several domestic crises were navigated with considerable skill. These largely concerned financing renewed warfare, with parliaments called in 1371 and 1373 to obtain loans and subsidies. In both instances, Edward was forced to make concessions to the political nation to secure necessary funding, notably by replacing several senior ministers who were churchmen with lay officials. However, resentment about the kingdom's finances was building throughout the decade. This came to a head in 1376 in a parliament known to history as the Good Parliament, convened to provide further financing for the crown. When it met in April 1376, the assembly took advantage of the opportunity to present accumulated grievances, particularly regarding several of Edward's advisors. John of Gaunt also became a target of parliamentary criticism, especially after the Black Prince died from dysentery. On June 8, 1376, a relatively amicable solution was eventually worked out, with offending councillors dismissed and some additional reforms implemented. The fact that these tensions were resolved peacefully, and England was spared any form of revolt during Edward's long reign, testifies to the stability his reign had created on the domestic front despite the regular strains of financing extended wars. However, this stability was clearly fracturing. It would have been apparent to parliamentarians and nobles in 1376 that the king's health was deteriorating sharply. At age 64, and after nearly half a century on the throne, Edward became seriously ill from a large abscess in late September. Days later, he was making final amendments to his will in preparation for his expected death. But the old monarch rallied in the following weeks. However, early in February 1377, the abscess burst, severely limiting his mobility for his remaining months. When Edward died at Sheen Palace, near where Richmond Palace would later be built, on June 21, 1377, it was almost certainly from another stroke. He was 64 years old, having achieved extraordinary success during a long and influential reign as England's monarch. The most significant chronicler of Edward's reign, Jean Froissart, wrote movingly of Edward's death and funeral in his Chronicles on the 21st of June, 1377. The gallant and noble King Edward III departed this life. Edward was succeeded by his grandson Richard, son of the Black Prince, who was just 10 years old at his accession. Richard II would rule until his deposition in 1399, but his reign would be characterized by military reverses and domestic unrest, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Like his great-grandfather Edward II, arousing widespread discontent that foreshadowed the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. This makes Edward III's reign appear even more remarkable in retrospect, oasis of stability amid the chaos that characterized 14th and 15th century English politics. Edward III must be considered one of England's most successful and significant monarchs. In the 19th century, some historians began to criticize his reign, questioning whether it could be considered truly successful. Own moral standards on a medieval king rather than assessing Edward on his own terms. More recently, historians like Ian Mortimer and William Ormrod have successfully restored Edward III's reputation. While his final years witnessed some setbacks, particularly in France, he was by then very ill, with power having largely devolved to his sons. When we focus on Edward's active reign, there can be no doubt about his success. Under his rule, England reached the peak of its medieval power. Between the 1330s and 1360s, Edward was not just ruler of England, Wales, and much of Ireland, but was able to impose his authority over Scotland and large sections of northern and western France. Some territorial gains proved permanent, as with Berwick on the Anglo-Scottish border, while others lasted for centuries, as with Calais in northern France. The 100 Years' War that Edward initiated was crucial to the eventual formation of England and France as modern nation-states. When Edward sent requests for men and money throughout his dominions to fund his French campaigns, he was effectively commanding his officials to develop better methods of taxation and resource exploitation. This created the foundation of the modern nation-state, a governmental system expertly positioned to exploit available resources to the maximum extent possible. Much of Edward's territorial expansion was achieved through his outstanding abilities as a general and the military revolution he oversaw. The English longbow made England the military superpower of its age. At Halidon Hill, Crécy Neville's Cross, Poitiers, and other battles, English armies consistently defeated numerically superior French and Scottish forces. Moreover, an English army was quite possibly the first in Europe to utilize field artillery at Crécy in 1346. Edward's military prowess was not confined to land warfare, as demonstrated by his naval victory at Sluys in 1340. Edward III deserves recognition alongside great English military commanders like the Duke of Marlborough, whose victories during the War of Spanish Succession established England as a major European power, or the Duke of Wellington, whose Peninsular War campaigns and victory at Waterloo ended Napoleon's dominance of Europe. Edward's military achievement probably surpassed those of his grandfather, Edward I. While Edward I may have been more successful in converting military victories into lasting political changes, Edward III was arguably the superior battlefield commander. Beyond military success, Edward's achievements in other areas deserve recognition. In the late 1340s, he established the Order of the Garter, England's highest chivalric order to this day, contributing to England's reputation as the most chivalrous kingdom in medieval Europe. His reconstruction of Windsor Castle created a magnificent symbol of English royal power, while his successful management of England through the Black Death crisis demonstrated exceptional leadership during Europe's greatest medieval catastrophe. Perhaps as much as 1/3 of England's population died within half a decade. But rather than succumbing to the crisis, Edward guided the country through this period by stabilizing the economy through the Statute of Laborers, while strengthening local administration through enhanced powers for justices of the peace. Edward's reign also witnessed crucial constitutional development. Parliament became more important during his reign, and he began using many symbols that came to represent England itself, notably carrying the cross of St. George into battle. Perhaps Edward's greatest legacy was reorienting the courts and government to favor Middle English as the language of administration. As a result, when England and later Britain began establishing colonies worldwide, it was English that spread globally as the language of the English-speaking peoples. Edward III's reign encompassed remarkable military victories, constitutional innovations, cultural achievement, and successful crisis management. His transformation of England from a weak, divided realm into medieval Europe's dominant power makes him arguably England's greatest king. The young prince, who had learned statecraft through his mother's rebellion and Mortimer's usurpation, had become Edward III, King of England, and created a legacy that would influence British development for centuries. Though he could not achieve all his ambitions, his reign marked a crucial turning point in English history and established precedents that would guide the nation's emergence as a world power. As we drift toward peaceful sleep, we can reflect on this remarkable monarch who shaped the medieval world through brilliant generalship, innovative governance, and unwavering determination to restore England's greatness. His story reminds us that exceptional leadership can transform kingdoms, and that the pursuit of excellence, though costly, can create achievements that inspire generations. Sweet dreams, dear listener. Our journey through the Plantagenet dynasty draws to a close with these two remarkable Edwards, who transformed England from a troubled realm into medieval Europe's greatest power. May your slumber be filled with gentle dreams of victorious knights, magnificent castles, and the quiet glory of England's golden age.